Hey fam! This is Horcrux Harry. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. Fleur Delacour claimed Harry with ancient Veela Blood Rite age 9 and no other witch could touch him. Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. Silver Fire. In a sleeping world the summer Fleur Delacour turned 9, her grandmother's roses died. Not gradually, the way roses die in autumn, petals loosening one by one, color fading through orange to brown before the stem gives up entirely. These roses died in a single night, between the hour of 11 and the hour of midnight, every bloom going black at once as though something had passed through the garden and taken the warmth out of the air itself. Pauline Delacour found them the next morning and stood among the ruined stems for a long time without speaking. When she finally came inside, her face was carefully neutral in the way that meant she was frightened. Fleur had watched from the kitchen window. She was small for her age, all silver-white hair and enormous eyes, and she had learned early that her mother's careful neutral face meant she should ask no questions and make no sudden movements. She asked anyway. "Maman, what happened to the roses?" "Nothing, Sherry." Pauline poured herself coffee she didn't drink. "A frost." It was July. Southern France did not frost in July. Fleur said nothing more, but she filed the lie away in the careful interior drawer where she kept all the things adults said to her that didn't make sense. The drawer was already fairly full. The summer Fleur turned 9 was also the summer her Veela heritage announced itself without any polite warning whatsoever. It hadn't been a gradual thing for her, either. Her mother had explained, carefully and with the particular delicacy of someone who had prepared a speech, that Fleur would begin to notice certain abilities developing as she grew older. A natural charm. An affinity for fire. The ability to make humans feel things simply by proximity. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that couldn't be managed with composure and practice. What Pauline had not mentioned, could not have mentioned, because she had never experienced it herself, being only 1/4 Veela, was the rage. It came for the first time on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, when the boy next door threw a stone at Gabrielle. Gabrielle was 3 years old and sitting in the garden eating a plum. The boy, 12, red-faced, the kind of child who pulled wings off insects because no one had ever made him feel the cost of cruelty, had thrown the stone from over the fence, and it had hit Gabrielle on the arm, and Gabrielle had started to cry. And the world had gone white. Later, Fleur would try to describe it to her grandmother. The whiteness. The way her skin had gone hot from the inside, like something under her ribcage had struck a match. The way her hair had lifted, she'd felt it lift, felt each strand rise as though gravity had briefly forgotten its responsibilities. The way her hands had begun to glow. Her grandmother had listened with her eyes very still. Then she said, "Come with me," and took Fleur by the wrist and led her through the garden, past the roses which were still alive then, into the small stone outbuilding at the property's edge that Fleur had always been told was for storage. It was not for storage. The room inside was clean and circular, the walls lined with old books and older jars, and in the center stood a low table with markings burned into the wood that Fleur had never seen in any of her schoolbooks. Her grandmother's name was Inez, and she was 3/4 Veela, and she stood in that room with a straightness to her spine that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation for 9 years. "Sit down," Inez said. "I am going to tell you what you are." What Fleur was, according to Inez, was dangerous in the way that rivers are dangerous, not maliciously, not eagerly, but inevitably, given sufficient provocation. The Veela gifts, the real ones, not the decorative charm and the pretty fire, were older than the Ministry of Magic, older than Hogwarts, older than the modern conception of what magic was supposed to look like. They came from somewhere else, not exactly another world but another layer of this one, pressed against the visible surface like warmth through stone. Most Veela, diluted by generations of mixed blood, never touched those older gifts at all. The charm was there, the fire was there, the rage could be triggered, but the deepest things lay dormant. Inez was not most Veela. She took Fleur through it carefully over the weeks that followed, turning the lessons into a kind of school that happened in the circular room while the summer moved slow and golden outside. Fleur learned about the fire, How it was not destruction if she didn't want it to be, how it could be as warm as a hearth fire or as cold as magnesium depending on her intention. She learned about the rage and how to feel it rising and let it move through her without letting it out, which was like learning to hold very still in fast water. She learned about the charm and how to turn it down the way you turn down a lamp, because going through life at full brightness was exhausting for everyone including herself. And in the 4th week, on a Thursday evening while the light was going long and amber through the windows, Inez put a very old book on the table in front of Fleur, and opened it to a page near the back and said, "This is the thing I need you to understand." The page showed a diagram that looked like a constellation, lines connecting points, the whole thing drawn in silver ink that still shimmered faintly after what must have been centuries. Beside it, in cramped old French that Fleur had to work at, was a description. The Rite du Sang, the Blood Rite. "The oldest of the Veela rituals," Inez said, and her voice had gone careful in a way that made the hairs on Fleur's arms stand up. "Older than anything the wizarding world has catalogued. Most Veela alive today don't know it exists. The books that mention it are not in public collections." She tapped the page with one finger. "It should not be possible for a child your age to perform it. It requires full Veela heritage and conscious intent and a depth of magic that takes decades to develop." Fleur looked at the diagram. The lines connecting the points looked, now that she studied them, less like a constellation and more like two separate shapes being drawn toward each other. "What does it do?" Inez was quiet for a moment. Outside, something in the garden rustled, a bird, probably, or the wind moving through the roses. "It claims," she said finally. "It finds someone whose magic is compatible, resonant. Someone whose nature echoes yours across however much distance separates you. And it marks them. Both of you. A thread is made, and that thread doesn't break." "Like a marriage?" Fleur said, because that was the closest thing she could think of. "Older than marriage." Inez closed the book. "It is not a contract. It is not a law. It is a fact of nature. The way two rivers will eventually find the same ocean if the land allows it." Fleur looked at her grandmother for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" Inez met her eyes. "Because I need you to understand what it is," she said carefully, "before I tell you that you have done it." The room went very quiet. Fleur replayed the last 4 weeks in her mind, all the careful lessons, all the deliberate groundwork, the fire, the rage, the charm, the delicate management of things she hadn't known she possessed. She thought about the 14th of July, the stone, Gabrielle crying, the world going white. She thought about afterwards, when she'd been shaking in the kitchen and her hands had still been faintly luminous, and she'd felt something move through her, something too big and too purposeful to be just the rage, something that had felt like a message sent. She thought about the roses. "The roses," she said. Her voice came out very small. Inez nodded slowly. "The Rite sends through living things," she said. "Roots, water, the older connections. The roses were simply in the way." She folded her hands on the table. "It happened the night of the 14th. While you were sleeping. Whatever you felt that day, when Gabrielle was hurt, it was enough. The magic moved while your conscious mind was not there to direct it, and the Rite completed itself." "I was asleep," Fleur said. She could hear something strange in her own voice. Not quite panic. Something more like vertigo. "I was asleep and I didn't choose, the magic chose." "Your magic, yes, but I was 9, Fleur said. "I'm 9. "I know." "Who?" she said, because it was the only question that mattered. "Who did it? Who did it find?" And here Inez's face did something complicated. "I don't know his name," she said. "I traced the Rite as far as I could. I can tell you he is in Britain. I can tell you his magic is—" She paused. "Extraordinary is not a large enough word. There's something in him that the Rite recognized immediately, something very old and very powerful, and I think also very hidden. I believe he is someone who doesn't know what he is." She looked at Fleur with those very still eyes. "As you didn't know. Until now." Fleur sat in that room for a long time after her grandmother stopped talking. The silver ink on the closed book shimmered faintly in the evening light. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face. She was 9 years old and her magic had reached across the channel in her sleep and found someone and changed them, changed herself, without asking either of them. She thought, this is not fair. Then she thought, nothing about what I am is fair. Then she got up and went to bed. In a cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, Surrey, a boy who was nearly 9 years old was dreaming about light. He dreamed often, Harry Potter did. The cupboard didn't lend itself to restful sleep. Too small, too warm in summer, too cold in winter, the sound of his uncle's snoring carrying clearly through the thin wall. He had taught himself to go somewhere else when he closed his eyes, and the somewhere else was usually formless and dark in a way that was, at least, spacious. But lately the dreams had changed. Lately there was silver. Not threatening silver, not the silver of knives or the silver of car headlights through the gap under the cupboard door. This was warmer. This was the silver of, he didn't have words for it, at 8 years old, sleeping in his cupboard. He just knew it felt like warmth from a direction he hadn't known existed. Like a window opening in a room that had never had windows. The night Fleur's magic found him, he woke at 11:53 on the 14th of July, sat up so fast he hit his head on the low shelf above his cot, and pressed his hand flat against his chest because something there was, singing was too large a word, humming. A vibration so deep in his sternum it felt geological. Like something had shifted under his foundations and the settling hadn't finished yet. He sat in the dark for a long time. His hand on his chest. The humming fading slowly. Then he lay back down and looked at the slats of the staircase above him and thought, in the way that children who have survived difficult circumstances think about strange new things, well, that's different. He didn't know what it was. He wouldn't know for years. But he was a pragmatic child in the way that you become pragmatic when the world is reliably unkind. He catalogued it, filed it, and went back to sleep. In the morning he noticed that Aunt Petunia's prize roses, which lined the front walk and which she tended with a ferocity that bordered on personal, had all gone black overnight. She blamed the neighbor's dog. Harry, who had watched the roses from his cupboard's high ventilation grill and could confirm that no dog had been anywhere near them, said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. It was one of his best skills. But he watched the ruined roses all morning with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to the knowledge that he had been involved, somehow, in something he didn't understand. Some transaction had occurred. Some exchange. And whatever he'd given, or whatever had been given to him, it hummed still, faint and constant, like a second heartbeat pressed just behind the first. The years moved. Harry grew in the way that children grow under bad conditions, not stopped, but shaped by the pressure, developing a kind of density that easier childhoods don't produce. He was small, he was thin, he wore Dudley's old clothes that pulled around his wrists and ankles, and he had a scar on his forehead that he'd had so long it felt like a birthmark. He also had, increasingly, a problem. The problem was that his magic didn't behave. Not in the way of a child who couldn't control accidental magic. That was normal, the ministry sent letters about that. Aunt Petunia had received 3 and kept them in an envelope in her kitchen drawer with the kind of horror she usually reserved for tax notices. Harry's magic behaved in accidental ways regularly enough, and he'd long ago decided that the mailbox was strategically positioned so he could intercept most of those letters before Petunia saw them. No. The problem was the other kind. The problem was the way he could feel, on certain days, that the air around him was live, charged, responsive, like the moment before lightning in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The problem was that when he was angry, which happened occasionally because he was 10 years old and being made to cook breakfast for people who treated him like furniture, the light bulbs in the kitchen would not just flicker but glow brighter, much brighter, incandescent, before he got himself together. The problem was that he'd started having the feeling, more days than not, that he could reach out to things with some part of himself that wasn't his hands and they would respond. He didn't reach out. He was careful about that. He'd learned early that unusual things that happened in his vicinity resulted in his being blamed for them, and being blamed resulted in the cupboard, and the cupboard was small enough without spending extra time in it. But he felt the capacity there the way you feel a word that's on the tip of your tongue, present, insistent, waiting. And underneath it all, always, the hum. The warm second heartbeat hum that had lived in his sternum since the night the roses died, so familiar now that he only noticed it when it changed pitch, which it did, sometimes, at odd moments. Once in the Tesco when he was 7, when he'd walked past a girl with very pale hair whose eyes had met his and then widened, and the hum had spiked so sharply he'd stumbled. The girl had stumbled too. They'd stared at each other for 3 seconds over a display of baked beans, and then her mother had steered her away, and Harry had stood there for a moment with the hum resonating in his teeth before it settled back to its usual register. He'd thought about that girl sometimes afterwards. The pale hair. The 2 wide eyes. He'd thought she felt it too. He hadn't known what to do with that thought, so he'd filed it, as he filed most things, and kept moving. The letter came on a Tuesday, which was a perfectly ordinary day until it wasn't. Harry was 11 and 3 months, and he was making eggs, and he heard the post come through the slot, and something changed in the hum. Not the spike he'd felt in Tesco, not the geological shift of that first night, something more deliberate. Something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, like a door that had been waiting for a long time had finally decided to open. Dudley found the letters first because Dudley always found the letters first. It was a game he played with great enthusiasm, and then Dudley dropped them on the floor because one of them had Dudley's name on it, the electricity bill, which was an anticlimax for everyone, and the others fanned across the linoleum, and one of them, green ink on yellowish paper, heavy stock, addressed in a handwriting that was too precise to be accidental, landed face up with Harry's name on it. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry picked it up. He'd received letters before, exactly never, and so he didn't have a framework for the feeling of holding one addressed to himself. It was stranger than he'd expected. The stock was thick under his fingers, the paper slightly warm, from Dudley's hands probably, or possibly from the morning sun that was coming through the kitchen window, and the ink caught the light oddly, going briefly gold at an angle before returning to green. He looked at it for 5 seconds. Then he broke the wax seal, which bore an insignia he didn't recognize, a badger and a lion and a snake and an eagle grouped around the letter H, and unfolded the parchment inside. He read it twice. The second time, slowly. By the time he finished, the hum in his sternum had gone quiet in the way that things go quiet after a long-held tension finally releases. Not silent, never silent anymore, not since he was 8, but still. Resolved. Like a string that had been tuned for 3 years was finally played. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He turned the words over in his mind like stones. We are pleased to inform you. Pleased. They were pleased. He thought about the years of eggs and Dudley's old clothes. He thought about the light bulbs. He thought about the girl in Tesco with the pale hair who had stumbled when he stumbled. He thought about the hum, constant as breathing, warm as something he couldn't name because he hadn't been given enough to compare it to. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in the pocket of his enormous borrowed shirt, and went back to the eggs before they burned. He didn't run. He didn't exclaim. He wasn't that kind of 11-year-old. But something had shifted behind his eyes, a setting changed, a dial moved from waiting to ready, and he stood at the stove with the morning light coming in and the eggs hissing in the pan, and he thought, with absolute quiet certainty, everything is about to be different. There was a second thing in the envelope. He found it that night, in the cupboard, when he went through the letter again by torchlight. It had been folded separately, a smaller square, tucked inside the main letter, and it wasn't from Hogwarts. The parchment was different, thicker and almost luminous, and the writing on it was in a language he didn't recognize but could somehow, inexplicably, half-read. As though some part of him knew it better than his conscious mind did. He puzzled it out slowly. The light from the torch caught the silver ink and made it easier. The words, as best he could translate them, and he couldn't have said later how he translated them, because he never learned whatever language this was, read something like, "The thread is confirmed. The mark is settled. When the time is right, you will know what this means. Until then, be what you are. All of it." Below that, no name. Just a small drawing, two shapes being drawn toward each other, like a constellation of two. Harry stared at it for a very long time. Be what you are. All of it. He thought about every time he dimmed himself down, made himself smaller, tucked away the bright live wire feeling of his own magic because it made people uncomfortable. He thought about Aunt Petunia's face when the light bulbs flared. He thought about how he'd got so good at being invisible. He read the line again. Be what you are. All of it. He folded the parchment, smaller this time, and tucked it separately from the Hogwarts letter. In a different pocket. Closer. In the south of France, Fleur Delacour was 14 years old and sitting in her grandmother's circular room, which felt smaller than it had when she was 9 and also more like home than it had when she was 9. And she was reading from the old book with the silver ink because her grandmother had finally given her the full version. She'd known, of course, she'd known since she was 9, and Inez had told her that she'd done something that couldn't be undone. She'd spent 5 years learning to live with the knowledge the way you learn to live with a scar, not pretending it wasn't there, not letting it rule everything, just incorporating it into your sense of your own shape. The boy in Britain. The extraordinary magic. The thread that didn't break. What she hadn't understood, at 9, was what the thread did. She understood it better now. Not completely. The old books were not concerned with being helpful, they were concerned with being thorough, which was a different thing, but better. The thread was not control. It wasn't a leash in either direction. What it did, according to the most legible section of the relevant chapter, was amplify resonance. The magical frequencies that were already compatible between two people would become more so over time, until they were each effectively a tuning fork for the other's power. Which meant, she thought, setting the book down and looking at the ceiling, that whatever was already extraordinary about the boy in Britain had been 5 years in the process of becoming more so. She felt something between excitement and vertigo when she thought about that. Possibly both. She also felt, reliably and with irritating frequency, the thread itself, or what she understood to be the thread, which was a warmth in her sternum that she'd once thought was a symptom of something wrong with her heart before Inez explained. It had been there since she was 9. It had a texture to it, a character, sometimes steady and calm, sometimes active and sharp, occasionally so bright she had to sit down. Tonight it was steady. Calm. As if whatever the thread was attached to on the other end had recently had something resolved. She pressed her hand to her sternum. "Who are you?" she asked, which was a question she asked periodically, in the same way people talk to houseplants, not expecting an answer, but feeling better for having said the words. The thread hummed back at her, warm and constant and thoroughly unhelpful. She picked up the book again. Inez found her there an hour later and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, Fleur cross-legged on the stone floor with the old book open and 3 additional books arranged around her in a semicircle, and her pale hair loose around her shoulders and her face set in the specific expression of someone who has decided that understanding something is a personal challenge. "You look like me at your age," Inez said, with something in her voice that might have been pride or might have been warning or might have been both. Fleur looked up. "The amplification effect," she said without preamble, because she had her grandmother's habits if not her years. "It's been running for 5 years. What does that mean for where he is now?" Inez came in and sat, which meant she was taking the question seriously, which Fleur appreciated. "It means," Inez said slowly, "that if his magic was extraordinary before the rite, it is probably now something that will make powerful people deeply uncomfortable. They'll want to contain it. They always want to contain things they don't understand. Will they be able to?" Inez looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. "What do you think?" she said. Fleur thought about the thread. About the character of it, the particular quality of whatever she sensed through it, which she had never been able to describe precisely but which she always thought of as the feeling of a very large fire that had never been given room to be fully itself. Bright and pressured and patient in the way of things that have learned to wait. "No," she said. "I don't think they'll be able to contain it at all." She looked back at the book. "I think they're going to try anyway," she said. "And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch." Across the channel, in a small room at the leaky cauldron that smelled of old wood and hot wax, a man named Albus Dumbledore was reading a report. The report was from a specialist at the Department of Mysteries, a woman whose specific expertise was in pre-modern magical signatures, the old forms, the things that preceded the modern wizarding world's tidy categorical systems. She had been asked to assess an anomaly that had appeared in the British Magical Registry 5 years prior, a sudden and dramatic shift in one Harry James Potter's latent magical signature. The report was 8 pages long. The relevant section was on page 3. The signature shift observed in July 1989 is not consistent with any known form of accidental magic, spontaneous magical development, or externally applied charm or enchantment. The closest historical precedent in our records is a category of pre-modern Veela ritual formally classified as extinct. The signature carries characteristics consistent with an ancient blood rite of continental origin, specifically the type historically associated with full heritage Veela families of southern France and northern Spain. The implications of this for the subject's magical development are significant. The resonance amplification effect documented in historical accounts of this rite would, if currently active, suggest that the subject's magical capacity may be considerably beyond what standard assessment metrics are designed to measure. We recommend immediate further assessment. Dumbledore set the report on his desk and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked out his window at the dark London street, and clasped his hands beneath his chin and sat with the silence of someone filing away a piece of information for later use. He thought about a boy in a cupboard. He thought about a plan he had been building for a decade, a long, careful architecture of timing and necessity, and about the role that boy was meant to play in it. He thought about the word amplification and what that might mean for a child who was already, according to every source Dumbledore had consulted, magically exceptional before the rite had ever touched him. He thought, this will need to be managed carefully. He pulled a piece of parchment toward him and began to write. Harry Potter stood on the platform at King's Cross and looked at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and the hum in his chest was louder than it had been since the night the roses died. He was 11 years and 4 months old. He was carrying a trunk that contained books and a wand made of holly and phoenix feather that had done something odd when he'd held it in Ollivander's shop, had warmed immediately, the way the second parchment in his Hogwarts envelope had warmed, the same character to it, like recognition, and a cage containing an owl he'd named Hedwig because she was very white and very dignified and the name felt right. He looked at the barrier. The hum said, "Go through." He went through. And on the other side, the Hogwarts Express was red and loud and smelled of coal smoke and something sweet, and children in pointed hats were moving in every direction, and Harry Potter stood on the platform for exactly 3 seconds taking it all in before something settled completely behind his eyes. Ready, the feeling said. Not afraid. Not overwhelmed. Just ready. He picked up his trunk and walked toward the train, and the hum walked with him, warm and constant and oriented. Like a compass, he thought suddenly. Not pointing north. Pointing towards something specific, something that had a character as familiar to him now as his own heartbeat. Something that was not here, not yet, but that was also, absolutely, undeniably, part of the geography of his future. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her face, though somewhere in the back of his mind there was pale hair and 2 wide eyes in a Tesco aisle and a stumble over baked beans that had been too symmetrical to be coincidence. But the thread was there. Had always been there. He stepped onto the train. Everywhere is different now, he thought. Everything is different now. The door closed behind him. The train began to move. Chapter 2. The boy who didn't hide the sorting hat sat on Harry's head for 4 seconds. Most students got longer. Ron Weasley, who had gone 3 people before Harry, had sat under the brim for nearly a minute while the hat muttered audibly about loyalty and a family legacy it seemed to find simultaneously impressive and limiting. Hermione Granger had gone immediately, the hat barely touching her curls before shouting Gryffindor with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting all year to make that particular call. Harry sat down, the hat dropped over his eyes, and in the darkness he heard a voice that was old in a way that had nothing to do with age. Old the way stones are old, Layard say, very quietly, "Oh. Just that. Then I see. Yes. I see what you are." Harry thought, with the practical directness that had served him through 11 years of difficult circumstances. Good. Then we're on the same page. The hat made a sound that might have been a laugh. You're not afraid of it. Should I be? A pause. Most people are afraid of things this size. Most people didn't spend 3 years sleeping in a cupboard, Harry thought back. You learn to stop being afraid of things you can't change. That, said the hat, with something that sounded almost like respect, is not quite the right lesson. But it will do for now. Better be, Gryffindor. Harry pulled the hat off and handed it to Professor McGonagall, and walked to the Gryffindor table. He didn't grin and wave the way some of the others had. He sat down, looked around the great hall, at the enchanted ceiling doing its moving sky impression, at the hundreds of candles, at the 4 long tables and the high table where the staff sat, and thought that it was very large and very golden and that the hum in his sternum, which had been building since King's Cross, had settled into something warm and specific the moment he'd crossed the threshold. It felt like the right place. He helped himself to roast chicken and listened to Percy Weasley explain the house points system, and watched Hermione Granger across the table already trying to memorize the names of every ghost. Normal things. The beginning of things. He was ready. The first week at Hogwarts taught Harry 3 things. The first was that magic, real magic, formal magic with wands and words and structured intent, felt like finally having a language for something he'd been trying to say since he was 8 years old. The first time he performed Wingardium Leviosa in charms, Professor Flitwick had barely finished the syllables of instruction before Harry had the feather off the desk and spinning slowly in the air, rotating at a precise horizontal angle he'd achieved through no particular effort. The thing in his chest had given a warm pulse like something approving of itself. Flitwick had squeaked. Hermione, 3 seats down, had given him a look that was equal parts impressed and suspicious. He didn't do it again that lesson. Not because he was hiding it. He wasn't the hiding sort anymore, he'd decided. The second parchment's instruction had settled something in him. But because the lesson only called for a hovering feather, and he wasn't interested in showing off. He just wanted to understand the shape of the thing. The second thing Hogwarts taught him was that fame was complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd known his name meant something in the wizarding world. Hagrid had been fairly thorough on that point. But knowing and experiencing were different categories. The stares in the corridor. The whispers. The way second years he'd never met pointed at his forehead. He handled it the way he handled most uncomfortable things, which was to be very calm and very direct and to give it less energy than it was trying to take. If someone stared, he met their eyes evenly until they looked away. He didn't perform modesty and he didn't perform importance. He just was what he was, which turned out to be disarming in a way he hadn't planned. The third thing was Draco Malfoy. Malfoy was the kind of person who organized the world into categories and spent a significant amount of time and energy maintaining those categories, because if the categories shifted he would have to revise his understanding of where he stood in them, and that was clearly too much to ask. He had found Harry on the train, offered his hand, received a measured look and a non-handshake, and apparently filed this under temporary setback because he reappeared at the start of the first week with fresh material and a better audience. "You've got the whole chosen one thing going," Malfoy said on the third day, loudly enough for the corridor to hear. "Must be a lot of pressure, living up to all that. Shame your parents couldn't stick around to help." The corridor went a little quiet. People waiting for the response, for the flinch, probably, the flash of grief or anger that would confirm that the words had landed. Harry looked at Malfoy for a moment. "Are you always this boring?" he said, in a conversational tone. Or are you making a special effort? Then he walked to Transfiguration, and left Malfoy standing in the silence he'd made. Hermione caught up to him at the classroom door. You know he's going to keep going, she said quietly. It's how he establishes hierarchy. I know, Harry said. You're not worried? He held the door open for her. No. She studied him as she went through. You're strange, she said, not unkindly. Probably, he agreed, and followed her in. McGonagall's Transfiguration class was where things got properly interesting. She had them start with match to needle, which was first-year standard. The theory was that you needed to understand the fundamental relationship between object and intent before you could attempt anything more complex. Most students spent the class period coaxing their matches into partial transformations, tips going silver, bodies staying wooden. Harry turned his into a needle on the first attempt. Then he turned it back into a match. Then, because the class had 20 minutes left, and he wanted to understand why it had worked so easily, he turned it into a needle again and considered it carefully. The change wasn't just cosmetic. The mass was different, the material was different, the function was different. He'd redirected the thing's essential nature with a thought and a small motion of his wand. He thought about what that meant. About the gap between the word transfiguration and the reality of it. He turned the needle into a small fish. It was silver and about 3 centimeters long, and it flipped itself off his desk onto the floor, which he hadn't anticipated, and he had to quickly transfigure it back before it became a welfare concern. McGonagall appeared at his elbow between one breath and the next, in the way she had of moving through classrooms silently and arriving precisely where she was needed. She looked at his match, which was a match again and sitting perfectly still, and then at his face, and then back at the match. Mr. Potter, she said. Professor. The assignment was a match to a needle. Yes, Professor. Not a needle to a match to a needle to a fish to a match. The fish was an accident. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the careful neutral that he recognized, the same one his aunt used when she was frightened, but on McGonagall it had a different quality, not fear, exactly. More like recalibration. Stay after class? She said. He stayed after class. She asked him questions. How long had he known he was a wizard? Had he had any formal training? Had anyone worked with him on wand work before Hogwarts? His answers were consistently no, no, and no. She wrote something in her notebook and looked at him with an expression he'd see again, on various faces, throughout his years at Hogwarts. The expression of someone encountering a thing that doesn't fit their existing model and isn't sure whether to be pleased or concerned. You've had no training, she said finally. No. And no exposure to magical theory. I read the textbooks on the train, Harry said. All of them. But that's it. McGonagall wrote something else. Then she said, The Transfiguration curriculum for your year will progress at a certain pace, Mr. Potter, determined by what the majority of students can manage. I want you to understand that if you find the pace insufficient, I'll manage, Harry said. That, said McGonagall, with what might have been the very beginning of a smile, is rather what concerns me. Snape's potions class was a different kind of interesting. Harry had been warned about Snape by Percy Weasley and, more colorfully, by the Weasley twins on the train, but he'd categorized these warnings in the general section of information requiring personal verification because people's accounts of other people were rarely complete. He sat at the front because the front row was where you could see the board most clearly, put his things on the desk in an organized way, and waited. Snape entered the way he did everything, as though the room was already his, as though the students were temporarily permitted to occupy it. He took attendance with the air of someone doing everyone a significant favor, and when he reached Harry's name he paused a half-beat longer than the others. Ah yes, Snape said. Harry Potter. Our new celebrity. The class shifted. This was clearly a known dynamic, a familiar opening, a routine with an expected arc. Harry looked at Snape directly. Black eyes, unreadable, the sort of face that had been carefully arranged to reveal nothing, and said nothing. The expected response to our new celebrity was a flush, or a protest, or a laugh to defuse the tension. Harry simply looked back. Snape's eyes narrowed very slightly. He proceeded to the rapid-fire questioning. Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Classic hazing, designed to establish early that knowledge had a hierarchy and Snape was at the top of it. Harry had read the textbooks on the train. He'd also, being the kind of person he was, read the supplementary texts he'd found at Flourish and Blott's while Hagrid was buying his birthday cake, because the supplementary texts were more interesting. He answered the asphodel and wormwood question correctly, then the bezoar question, then the monk's hood and wolfsbane question, each time in the same calm tone, not showing off, just answering. By the third answer Snape's expression had moved from contemptuous to something more careful. By the fourth, which Harry answered with a clarification that the question as phrased had two possible correct responses depending on whether you were working with fresh or dried wolfsbane, Snape was looking at him the way McGonagall had looked at the match needlefish incident, with that quality of recalibration. 10 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, which from the reactions around him was clearly not a common occurrence. Though I suspect you have been coached. I read the books, Harry said. Sir? The sir was afterthought enough to make the sentence interesting. Snape stared at him for a moment longer. Then he moved on. Ron leaned toward Harry from his adjacent stool. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, he whispered, or the stupidest. Which do you think? Harry whispered back. Ron considered. Brave, he said. Definitely brave. But also possibly stupid. I'll take that, Harry said, and began measuring out his asphodel. He wrote to no one that first month, because there was no one to write to. This fact arrived at him on a Wednesday evening in the common room while everyone else was writing home. Ron to his mother, Hermione to her parents, Neville to his grandmother, the scratching of quills at every table, and he sat with Hedwig on his shoulder and experienced a brief and entirely honest moment of acknowledging that he was almost entirely without anchor. No family that meant anything. No home to go back to. No one who had known him before this year who he wanted to remember him. Just the hum in his sternum, warm and constant. He scratched Hedwig between her ear tufts and thought, that's fine. This is the before. The after is going to be different. He took out parchment and wrote to Gringotts instead, asking the questions about his family vault that Hagrid had never quite answered and that he felt, at 11 years old, he had the right to have answered. He wrote it in clear and direct language and addressed it to the account manager he'd met in July, and sealed it, and gave it to Hedwig, and told her she was very good and very professional and to take all the time she needed. Hermione had watched this entire process from across the table. You're writing to your bank, she said. Someone has to, Harry said. She considered this. That's actually very sensible, she said, in the tone of someone who appreciated sensibility enough to acknowledge it even when it surprised her. I've been meaning to ask my parents to help me open an account. You should, Harry said. The interest rates are better than standard. She stared at him. How do you know about Gringotts' interest rates? I read the prospectus in the lobby while we were waiting for Hagrid to sort out his errand, Harry said. It was on a stand. It was interesting. Hermione Granger looked at Harry Potter for a long moment with an expression that he would come to know very well over the years, the expression of someone who has found something they didn't expect to find and is simultaneously delighted and unsettled by it. We should be friends, she said, with the same directness she applied to everything. Yeah, Harry said. I thought so too. The thing with his magic became impossible to overlook by mid-October. It wasn't that he was trying to be noticed. He wasn't, particularly. The attention that came with being Harry Potter was already more than sufficient, and he had no desire to add to it. But there was a difference, he was finding, between not showing off and actively suppressing what he was, and the second parchment's instruction had drawn a clear line on that distinction. Be what you are. All of it. He was doing his best to honor that. The problem was that what he was kept exceeding the expected parameters of a first year. In charms, Flitwick had moved him to independent study in the third week after he'd mastered every charm in the first year's syllabus ahead of schedule. Not ahead by a lesson or two, ahead entirely, including 2 charms that weren't covered until second year. Flitwick was delighted in the high-pitched way of someone encountering a genuinely interesting problem, and gave Harry a stack of second-year texts with the energy of a man distributing birthday presents. In Transfiguration, he and McGonagall had reached an understanding that he would work on the assigned exercises for the first 10 minutes of class to confirm mastery, and then she would give him something more demanding. She seemed to have decided that containing him was less useful than directing him, which he appreciated. Flying was, frankly, ridiculous. He hadn't been on a broom before the first lesson. He hadn't had any reason to be. He'd gone into it with no particular expectation, had mounted the broom and kicked off, and had understood immediately and instinctively that he and broomsticks had a fundamental agreement with each other that would never require discussion or negotiation. He'd pulled a series of maneuvers in the first 5 minutes that had Madame Hooch staring upward with her hands on her hips, and then Neville's Remembrall had gone up and Harry had gone after it, and caught it, and that had been that. McGonagall had found him afterwards and offered him the seeker position with the studied casualness of someone trying not to seem as pleased as she was. Harry had said yes, because flying was one of those things that felt like the truest version of what he was, unconfined, three-dimensional, fast, and he wanted as much of it as possible. What he hadn't expected was the effect his flying had on people. Not just the watching something impressive effect, though that was there. Something else. The way the air around him went slightly live when he was on a broom, slightly charged, the way it had in his worst moments at Privet Drive but directed now, purposeful. He noticed other students unconsciously leaning toward the pitch when he was flying, drawn without knowing why. He noticed that after his practices, the common room felt warmer. He'd also noticed Quirrell. He noticed Quirrell the way you notice a wrong note in a song you know well, not immediately, not consciously, but with a persistent low-grade sense that something didn't fit. The stutter seemed deliberate rather than physiological. The nervousness was too performed. And when Quirrell looked at Harry, which he did with the frequency of someone instructed to monitor something, there was a quality to his gaze that put Harry in mind of the feeling he'd had in the cupboard as a very young child, the feeling of being watched by something that wanted something from him. He filed Quirrell in the category of active concerns and watched back, and said nothing to anyone yet, because he didn't have enough information to be useful. Dumbledore noticed Harry the way Harry had begun to suspect Dumbledore noticed everything, from a careful distance and through intermediaries. The intermediary in October was McGonagall, who appeared in the library on a Tuesday afternoon and sat across from Harry with the air of someone delivering a message they'd been asked to deliver diplomatically. She informed him that the headmaster was pleased with his progress. She said pleased in a way that managed to communicate that the headmaster's pleasure was conditional, which was interesting, and that there were additional resources available to exceptional students, supplementary programs, specific tutors. Harry looked up from the fourth-year charms text he was working through. "What kind of additional resources?" he said. "Guided development," McGonagall said carefully. "Structured progression. The theory being that talent benefits from direction?" Harry said. "Guidance." He thought about this for a moment. Not the offer itself but the architecture behind it, why Dumbledore was offering this now, what exactly structured progression meant, and whether the structure in question was designed to develop him, or manage him. "I appreciate it," he said, and he meant it, because he didn't think Dumbledore was malicious. "But I'm doing all right with the texts. If I get stuck I'll ask Professor McGonagall or Professor Flitwick." McGonagall looked at him. "The headmaster was quite, I know," Harry said pleasantly. "Tell him thank you." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly and off-script and as herself rather than as a messenger, "Harry, you understand that the people who want to help you are not all the same as the people who want to manage you." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I do understand that. You're one of the helping ones." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite softened, she wasn't the softening sort, but adjusted. "Good," she said. And she gathered herself back into Professor McGonagall and left him to his texts. He watched her go. Then he wrote Dumbledore, managing impulse, watched for structuring in the margin of his notebook, small enough that it looked like a calculation, and turned the page. Halloween arrived in the traditional way, which is to say with a troll. Harry was in the corridor when he heard it, a sound like something structural being damaged, rhythmic and large, coming from the direction of the girls' bathrooms on the ground floor. He was already moving before the screaming started, because the sound wasn't ambiguous and waiting for more information was a luxury people inside the building didn't have. Ron was with him, because Ron had been walking back from the bathrooms himself, and had the look of someone who was already committed even if he hadn't entirely decided yet. Troll, Harry said because he'd read Fantastic Beasts cover to cover, and the sound pattern was clear. How do you? Ron started. Mountain troll, 12 feet, the sound has a specific acoustic signature. Harry was already considering the options. Hermione's in the bathroom. Ron went slightly pale. Right, he said. Okay. Right. The girls' bathroom door was already off its hinges when they got there. The troll was inside, which made the space considerations interesting. 12 feet in a room that wasn't designed for 12 feet of anything, swinging a club with the thoughtful indifference of a creature that was doing something it understood perfectly well but that had no particular emotional investment. Hermione was pressed into the corner behind a bank of sinks, which was good cover but finite. Harry took it in for exactly 2 seconds. Then he acted. Not the way the story got told afterwards. No dramatic build, no inspiring speech. He locked his attention onto the troll's club arm, said Wingardium Leviosa with the same ease he'd said it the first time in Flitwick's class, and put more of himself into it than he had with the feather. Not an extravagant amount. Just enough. The club went straight up. The troll looked at its empty hand with the expression of something profoundly confused. Then Harry froze its legs. It wasn't a spell they'd been taught. It wasn't even properly a spell the way formal spell work was a spell. It was closer to what happened when he was very young and accidentally did things, except now he'd aimed it, and the troll sat down hard on the bathroom floor with a sound like a building settling, and Hermione scrambled out of the corner. And Ron cast the disarming jinx he'd been practicing all week that hit the troll in the knee and did very little but completed his personal investment in the situation. The troll blinked at all 3 of them. Then the professors arrived. McGonagall's face went through several things very quickly. Snape arrived half a second behind her and stood in the doorway with an expression that had no obvious name. Quirrell arrived after both of them, slightly out of breath, and Harry watched him from the corner of his eye and noted that Quirrell was looking at him specifically, not at the troll, with an attention that was too focused for the situation. He filed that away. Explain, McGonagall said, in the voice that didn't leave room for options. We heard the sounds from the corridor, Harry said. Hermione was inside. We didn't have time to find a teacher first. He paused. Troll's fine. Incapacitated but not hurt. McGonagall looked at the 12-foot troll sitting on the floor of the girls' bathroom looking confused. You incapacitated it, she said. Yes, Professor. She looked at him with that recalibration expression. How? The Wingardium charm for the club, Harry said. The mobility restriction was less formal. He searched for a reasonable way to explain this. More intuitive. More intuitive, Snape repeated from the doorway, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite anything else. 20 points each to Gryffindor, McGonagall said, which seemed to surprise everyone in the room including her slightly. And 5 points to Gryffindor for the Expelliarmus, Mr. Weasley, which showed good instinct even if the target was significantly out of scale. Ron stood straighter. She turned to Harry. The brief look she gave him lasted only a second, but it had a quality of acknowledgement to it, not approval exactly, more a mutual recognition of a fact neither of them was going to articulate in present company. I know what you are, it said. I'm still working out what to do with that. Harry gave a small nod. Then Dumbledore arrived, slightly after everyone else, and swept the room with those particular eyes of his that had the quality of reading everything simultaneously. They settled on Harry for a moment longer than anywhere else, and Harry looked back with calm directness, and Dumbledore's expression did something that might have been, very faintly, surprise. It was gone immediately. Replaced with benign concern, the headmaster's public face, warmth and authority in careful balance. "Well," Dumbledore said, "it seems everything is in hand." "Yes, sir," Harry said. "It seems so." The measured quality of the response, "It seems so," neither agreeing nor conceding, made Snape look at him sharply. Harry had already looked away. He didn't tell anyone about the second parchment. It wasn't secrecy exactly. He just didn't have enough information to give context, and information without context was noise, and he had a principled aversion to noise. But he took it out sometimes in the common room, after everyone had gone to bed, and read the constellation drawing by wan light, and thought about what he knew and what he didn't. He knew he had been marked. He knew it had happened when he was 8 years old. He knew that whatever this thread in his chest was, it came from outside, from somewhere across the channel. He felt the direction of it the way you feel a wind, not seeing but sensing, and that whoever was on the other end of it was alive and not dormant. He could feel that. The hum had texture and character, it waxed and waned. Sometimes he felt something that translated to concentration, and sometimes something that translated to amusement, and occasionally something that translated to worry, which always made him want to do something helpful except he didn't know where to direct it. He knew that whatever this was, it had changed him. Not created the power. He refused to believe that, because the power had been there before, in the cupboard, in the burning light bulbs, in the feeling of live wire running under his skin. But it had turned something up. Increased the volume that was already playing. He thought about what Dumbledore was trying to structure. He thought about the way the man watched him. He thought, he knows about this. Whatever this is, he knows. He folded the parchment, and held it in his closed hand for a moment. The thread hummed. Concentration, tonight? Whoever was on the other end was working through something. Learning something. Me too, he thought, in the direction of the thread, which was silly because it wasn't actually telepathic and he knew that. The hum gave a small, warm pulse. Or maybe it was. He tucked the parchment away and climbed the stairs to the dormitory and lay in the dark with his hands behind his head, not sleeping yet, running the year's inventory. The magic that kept exceeding its container. The professors adjusting to accommodate what he was. Dumbledore watching. Quirrell not being what he said he was. The thread, always the thread. A full year ahead of him. A school to learn. Something in this school worth protecting, he'd felt that already. The Philosopher's Stone that Hagrid had collected from Gringotts, the corridor on the 3rd floor, the chess piece guardians and the traps and the logic of it. Someone wanted it. He'd work out who. He turned onto his side. First, learn everything. Then, deal with whatever came. He was 11 years old, and completely unafraid of what was coming, and somewhere across the channel someone with pale hair and enormous eyes was feeling his calm through a thread that had been running since they were both too young to understand it, and she was setting down her book for the night with the feeling that whatever the thread was attached to had just made a decision. She pressed her hand to her sternum. Good, she thought, though she couldn't have said why. She turned out her light. Chapter 3. Silver and Scarlet. The Beauxbatons carriages arrived on a Thursday in late October, which was an odd day for anything to arrive at Hogwarts, but the sky had decided to cooperate, pale and cloudless in a way that made everything look clean-edged and significant. And the entire school had turned out on the grounds because Professor McGonagall had herded them there with the energy of someone managing a small military operation. Harry stood near the back of the Gryffindor group with his hands in his pockets and watched the sky. He'd known something was coming for 3 days. Not known in the way of having information, the Goblet of Fire announcement had been recent enough that the details were still circulating through the school in layers, 5th years explaining to 4th years, 4th years explaining to everyone else, the whole system of rumor and official communication running parallel to each other, as they always did at Hogwarts. He'd known in the other way. The thread way. For 3 days the hum in his sternum had been doing something it had never done before in 3 years of Hogwarts, which was to get louder. Not the spike he felt occasionally, sharper, warning register things that he'd come to associate with situations requiring attention. This was different. This was more like the volume being steadily increased on something that had always been present but manageable, and the increasing was directional, and the direction was toward whatever was coming. He was 14 now. He'd had 3 years to understand his own magic well enough to read its signals with reasonable accuracy. He read this signal as, arriving soon. Worth your full attention. Ron was beside him, vibrating with the particular excited energy of someone who had read too many competing accounts of Beauxbatons and was trying to reconcile them. "You think they'll be better at Quidditch or worse?" he said for approximately the 3rd time in an hour. "I don't know," Harry said. Which was true, and also the least interesting question available. Hermione, on his other side, was shading her eyes against the pale October light. She'd been doing research since the announcement, because Hermione's response to everything was research, and had a view on the international competitive history of the Triwizard Tournament that she was willing to share with anyone who stood still long enough. Harry had heard it twice already and found it more interesting the second time than the first, which was how he knew she'd done thorough work. "There," someone said, in the crowd ahead of them, and the sky showed it, a shape in the pale blue, too large to be birds, moving with the lateral swing of something pulled rather than flying under its own power. The Beauxbatons carriage was the size of a house in pale blue and drawn by horses that were so far outside the normal physical parameters of horse that calling them horses felt like a category error. They landed with the impact of something that knew it was impressive and had no particular need to understate it. And the hum in Harry's chest went from loud to deafening. He pressed his hand flat against his sternum, reflexively. The feeling wasn't painful, it was never painful, but the intensity of it was new and disorienting, a warmth so concentrated it felt like pressure. Something in his chest was pulling toward the carriage the way iron filings pull toward a magnet, insistent and physical and not at all under the jurisdiction of his conscious mind. He breathed out slowly. "All right," he thought. "There you are." Fleur Delacour stepped out of the carriage fourth in the line of Beauxbatons students, because she'd let 3 of her classmates go ahead while she stood at the top of the steps and breathed carefully through the thing happening in her chest. The thing that had started 3 days ago, when the carriages had crossed the English Channel. She'd expected it to be significant. She'd been preparing for it to be significant since she was 9 years old, and the preparation had become more informed as she'd gotten older and understood more, and she'd had 5 years to build a kind of intellectual framework around the idea of meeting the boy her magic had claimed. She'd expected to feel it. She'd expected it to be intense. She had not expected it to feel like this. The thread, which had been a warm, constant presence in her sternum for 5 years, familiar as breathing, textured and readable in hers, had in the last 3 days transformed itself into something that was almost sound. A resonance so deep she felt it in her back teeth. And now, standing at the top of the carriage steps with England stretching out around her in its pale October colors, with Hogwarts Castle rising behind the gathered students like something out of a very serious fairy tale, the resonance was locating itself. Directional. Pointing. There, it said, with the certainty of a compass finding north. She descended the steps. She was 17, 5'6", silver-white hair and gray eyes and the particular posture of someone who had been told since childhood that the way she held herself was a form of power, and had eventually decided to believe it. She wore blue robes, and she walked across the grass, and she did not look for him directly because she'd made herself a rule about that. She would not seek him out first, because she needed 5 minutes to be herself before she was whatever the thread made her, and she needed to look at him as a person before she looked at him as the answer to a question she'd been carrying since she was 9. She managed about 40 seconds. Then the resonance pulled, sharp and specific, and her eyes went to the crowd of Gryffindors almost against her will. Harry felt her find him. There wasn't another way to describe it. The thread that had been pulling toward the carriage in general pulled suddenly toward a specific point, and he looked up, and there she was. Pale hair. Gray eyes. A face that was, he didn't think beautiful first, which surprised him later when he considered it. He thought known. He thought there, the same way the thread had been saying there, like a recognition that preceded the moment of meeting. She was looking at him. He looked back. In the Tesco in 1991 they'd stared at each other for 3 seconds over baked beans, and then she'd been pulled away and he'd filed it under things to understand later. Now he understood later. Now he had a context for the stumble, for the 2 wide eyes, for the 3-second stillness in the middle of a grocery store aisle. He held her gaze. Neither of them said anything, because they were 50 feet apart in the middle of 2 schools worth of people, and there was nothing that could be said in that register that was meant for this many ears. But something passed between them across the 50 feet, through the thread that was now so loud he thought surely Ron could hear it, something that was more efficient than words. "I know," it said in both directions simultaneously. "I know, and I've been waiting, and here we are." Her chin lifted slightly. His shoulders settled. The thread gave one enormous resonant pulse that Harry felt in his ribcage and that made, inexplicably, one of the torches on the castle's outer wall flare twice as bright for exactly 3 seconds before returning to normal. Hermione noticed the torch. She looked at Harry. Then she looked at the Beauxbatons girl with the silver hair who was still looking at Harry. Then she looked back at Harry. "Harry," she said carefully. "I'll explain later," he said. "You will explain now, later," he said, and meant it, and she subsided with the expression of someone adding this to a very long list of things she was owed explanations for. The welcoming feast should have been straightforward. It was a feast, food, introductions, the traditional competitive assessment that happened whenever 2 schools were placed in proximity, the Beauxbatons students evaluating Hogwarts, and the Hogwarts students evaluating back. It was not straightforward. Fleur sat at the Ravenclaw table because Madame Maxime had placed her students with the houses whose academic reputation most closely aligned with Beauxbaton's own culture, and Ravenclaw had won that distinction narrowly. She ate very little and paid attention to the room with the careful comprehensive awareness of someone who'd been trained to read environments, and was also dealing with a magical resonance situation that was significantly more demanding in person than it had ever been at a distance. The thread was, loud was still the word. But it had settled from the initial intensity into something more manageable, more like a conversation happening below the threshold of words. She could feel him across the great hall. Feel the quality of him, and that was new, that was something the books hadn't fully prepared her for, the way the thread wasn't just a connection but a channel. She could feel that he was calm in the way of someone who had processed a significant thing and put it in context. She could feel that he was paying attention to the room with the same comprehensive quality she was. She could feel something that translated as amusement, specifically in the direction of the red-haired boy next to him who was eating with the dedication of someone competing against himself. She ate a piece of bread and watched him from the corner of her eye and tried to be systematic about this. She knew the rite. She knew its mechanics better than almost anyone alive, because she'd spent 5 years with access to Inez's library and a personal investment that exceeded academic interest by a considerable margin. She knew that the amplification effect had been running for 5 years. She knew, therefore, that whatever she was going to meet across this hall was not a typical 14-year-old. She had not, she admitted to herself, fully appreciated what not typical was going to look like in practice. Because she could feel it. Through the thread, without trying, the depth of whatever he was, the way his magic sat in the room around him, the way the air had a different quality in his vicinity. She'd felt powerful witches and wizards before, had grown up around her grandmother who was one of the most magically significant people in France, and this was different. This was layered, she thought. Like something that had been under pressure for a long time, and was only now beginning to have room. She thought about what Inez had said 5 years ago. I think also very hidden. I believe he is someone who doesn't know what he is. She amended that. He knew now. She could feel that too, the quality of someone who had made a particular peace with their own nature, who had decided not to be small about it. She respected that enormously. Across the hall, without looking at her directly, he smiled at something his red-haired friend said. The thread went warm in a way that had nothing to do with magic. She ate another piece of bread and decided that she needed to talk to him before the end of the week. The opportunity arrived the next morning, in the way that opportunities do when the universe has been arranging for them for 5 years and is frankly a little impatient about the timeline. Fleur was in the library at 7 in the morning because she'd slept badly. The thread had been active all night in the disorienting way of something running on a new setting, and she'd given up on sleep at 6:30 and decided that useful research was better than lying awake, and she was working through a Hogwarts text on advanced transfiguration because Beau's batons covered it differently, and she wanted the comparison. Harry walked in at 7:12. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up when she heard him stop. The thread did its thing, that resonant pulse, quieter than yesterday but still present, and they looked at each other across 4 rows of empty morning library, and Fleur thought, all right. Here we go. You're up early, he said. So are you, she said. Her English was good. She'd been working on it specifically for this year, though she hadn't told anyone the specific reason, with an accent that she'd stopped trying to diminish because it was part of how she sounded, and she was done diminishing things. He walked over. She watched him come and thought again, known. He moved like someone who had somewhere to be and wasn't in a hurry about it, which was a combination she found interesting. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, not asking if she minded, which she found more interesting. Harry Potter, he said. Fleur Delacour, she said. Silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable. So, he said. How long have you known? She blinked. She'd expected something more preliminary. She'd had a whole careful opening prepared, something measured and contextual that would ease them both into a conversation that was 17 years of layered complicated. Not how long have you known, direct as an arrow, straight to the center. Since I was 9, she said. What happened? He said, and the question was genuine. Not performing nonchalance and not performing drama. He actually wanted to know. She told him. She'd never told anyone the full account. She told pieces to her mother, to Gabrielle, had had careful technical discussions with Inez, but she'd never sat down and told the whole story from the stone to the roses to the circular room to 5 years of learning what she'd done. She told him now. She wasn't sure why, except that the thread made dishonesty feel structurally unsound, like building something on a foundation you knew was wrong. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. His expression was attentive and occasionally thoughtful, and when she reached the part about the roses dying he said, very quietly, Privet Drive, which meant he remembered. You felt it, she said. The night it happened, he said. I was 8. I woke up and there was this. He put his hand flat on his sternum, an automatic gesture, and she mirrored it without thinking, both of them sitting across a library table at 7 in the morning with their hands pressed to the same ache. I didn't know what it was. I thought about it for about a minute, and then I went back to sleep. She stared at him. You went back to sleep. I was 8, he said. What was I supposed to do? I don't know, perhaps not sleep. It wasn't threatening, he said reasonably. It was warm. I filed it. He considered. I'm a filing sort of person. She looked at him. The absurdity of this, the magnitude of what the rite was, what it meant, the 5 years she'd spent learning and worrying and preparing, and he had filed it, was almost too much to process. I have been thinking about this moment, she said carefully. For 5 years. I know, he said. I could feel that. Not the specifics, but the quality of it. There was thinking happening in your direction. That startled her. You felt it back? Not always. But sometimes. He was watching her with the direct, even gaze that she'd registered from across the great hall yesterday, and that was, in proximity, more notable. He didn't seem to do the thing that most people did around her, the unfocusing, the slight daze of someone being affected by Veela proximity. He looked at her clearly, as himself. Look, he said. I have a lot of questions. About the rite specifically. About what it does. I've had the thread for 5 years and I've been working out its mechanics from the inside, which is limited. I have been working out the mechanics from the outside, she said, which is also limited. So between us, we might actually understand it. She finished. He nodded. Something settled in the room, not a decision exactly, more the recognition of a fact that had already been established. She thought about what Inez had said, 2 rivers finding the same ocean. Not dramatic. Not magical destiny theatrical. Just inevitable, given the geography. I'm 14, he said, with the tone of someone noting a logistical fact rather than apologizing for it. I know, she said. I'm 17. That's going to make certain things complicated. Most things worth doing are complicated, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the structural element of one. All right, he said. What do you want to know first? She opened her notebook. They met in the library every morning that week, at 7, before the school woke up properly, and worked through it methodically. Fleur had the theoretical framework and the historical texts, which she'd brought from her grandmother's library and copies she'd made herself. Harry had the 5 years of practical data, what the amplification felt like from the inside, how it interacted with his wand work and his non-formal magic, the specific ways his power exceeded normal parameters and the rate at which that gap had been widening. Together, the picture that emerged was, she didn't have a word for it in either French or English that was fully adequate. Significant was technically accurate but felt inadequate. Enormous was more honest. The amplification isn't linear, she said on the 3rd morning, tracing through her notes. It compounds. 5 years of compounding resonance means, it's not just 5 years more powerful than I would have been, Harry said. He'd been following her reasoning with the focused ease of someone who processed things quickly and didn't need repetition. It's compounded on itself. Each year building on the last year's output. Yes. She looked up. Do you understand what that means practically? I have a rough idea. He was quiet for a moment. The first time I did magic at Hogwarts, McGonagall had me working on independent study within 3 weeks. I'm currently through the 4th year texts. She had heard this from the Hogwarts students' conversation around her, but hearing it directly was different. And without the rite? He shrugged. I don't know what I would have been without it. The power was always there. But probably not. He searched for the right word. Not this much. She wrote something in her notebook. He watched her write. What? He said. The rite selects for resonance, she said. It doesn't create from nothing. Whatever was already in you, the rite recognized it as compatible and amplified it. Which means that even without the rite you would have been extraordinary. She paused. The rite did not make you remarkable, Harry. It found something remarkable and turned the volume up. He was quiet. She looked up and found him looking at the table, and there was a quality in his expression she hadn't seen yet, something less guarded, more exposed. As though that specific piece of information had gone somewhere important. She thought about Inez saying, I think also very hidden. I believe he is someone who doesn't know what he is. She thought about a boy sleeping in a cupboard, filing things away, learning to be invisible. Someone told you for a long time that you weren't, she said. He looked up. The muggles I lived with, he said, direct as always. They didn't. He stopped, changed direction slightly. Let's say the cupboard under the stairs doesn't produce the most generous self-assessment. The cupboard under the stairs. She put her pen down. You lived in a cupboard. Until I was 11 and the Hogwarts letters started arriving, he said, with the tone of someone describing a weather pattern. Matter of fact. Already processed. It was small. But it was mine, which was more than Dudley could say for the rest of the house. She looked at him. She felt something moving through her that was partly the thread and partly entirely her own, a sharp, warm, almost maternal fury on behalf of the 8-year-old who had felt the right activate in a cupboard and gone back to sleep because warmth from an unknown direction was still more warmth than he was used to. She breathed through it. "You are not going back to a cupboard," she said. The words came out more fierce than she'd intended. He blinked. Then a real smile, the full version. She hadn't seen that yet, the complete one. It changed his face considerably. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." The rest of the school noticed them, of course. The rest of the school noticed everything. The rumored topology at Hogwarts was sophisticated and comprehensive, and a 4th-year Gryffindor and a 7th-year Beauxbatons student meeting privately every morning in the library for a week was exactly the kind of information the system processed with enthusiasm. Versions circulated. Some were merely inaccurate. Some were creative in ways that implied their authors had significant, untapped fictional talent. Ron brought the best version to Harry on Friday afternoon with the solemnity of someone delivering official information. "The working theory in Gryffindor," he said, "is that Fleur Delacour is secretly training you to be the Beauxbatons champion so that France wins the Triwizard Cup and you get to keep half the prize money." Harry stared at him. "That's not even internally consistent." Seamus added the prize money part. "It started as she thinks you're interesting, which is boring." "She does think I'm interesting," Harry said. Ron pointed at him. "So it's true?" "The interesting part," Harry said. "Not the Beauxbatons champion part. What are you actually doing in there every morning?" "Research." "Research," Ron repeated, with the tone of someone who had a specific relationship with that word, and it was not one of academic enthusiasm. "Yes." "We're—" Harry stopped, because the explanation required context he hadn't given anyone yet, and the library wasn't the right place to give it. "I'll explain properly when I can. For now, she's not a threat. She's not using me. We have a thing in common that neither of us fully understood before this week, and we're working it out." Ron processed this. He was good at processing, better than his default presentation suggested. He had a pragmatic intelligence that ran deeper than his grades indicated. "A thing in common," he said. "A significant thing." Ron looked at Harry for a moment. "Does Hermione know?" "She knows something's there. She's been waiting for the full explanation. She's been building a case," Ron said. "There's notes." "She has notes, Harry." He paused. "Is it dangerous?" "No," Harry said without hesitation. "Are you sure?" He thought about the thread, warm and constant, and about mornings in the library working through something that had been running since he was 8 years old, and about a girl who had been carrying a weight for 5 years that should have been shared and was finally putting it down. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure." Ron considered, then nodded, with the economy of someone who'd decided to extend trust and didn't need to make a production of it. "Right," he said. "I want the full story eventually." "You'll get it," Harry said. Hermione's response, when Harry finally sat her and Ron down in the corner of the common room on Saturday night and told them everything from the beginning, the cupboard, the roses, the parchment, the years of the Fleur's account of what she'd done and what it had done, was absolute silence for 45 seconds, followed by a barrage of questions so dense that Harry had to ask her to slow down twice. She worked through the implications with the focused intensity of a scientist encountering a new category of phenomenon. Ron listened with wide eyes and the expression of someone recalibrating several things simultaneously. When she finally ran out of immediate questions, Hermione sat back and looked at Harry with an expression that was half academic fascination and half something more personal. "You've had this connection, your entire time at Hogwarts," she said. "My entire time in England, essentially," Harry said. "Since I was 8. And it's been amplifying your magic for 5 years." "Yes." "Which explains the feather," she said. "And the fish," Ron said. "And the troll," Hermione said. "And everything in defense," Ron added. "Lupin nearly fell over last month when you, the point," Hermione said, overriding him with the precision of someone who had a specific destination. is that you're significantly beyond your year level because of a Veela blood rite that was performed on you when you were 8 years old, and Fleur Delacour is the one who performed it. She looked at him. How do you feel about that? It was a better question than most people would have asked in that moment. He thought about it honestly, because she deserved honesty. I was angry at first, he said. For about 5 minutes. When I finally understood what it was. Because it happened without my knowledge or consent, even though she didn't choose it consciously either. And now? Hermione said. Now I think it found something real, he said. And I think she's been carrying the guilt of it for 5 years, which she didn't deserve, because it wasn't a decision she made, it was a decision her magic made when she was 9 years old and frightened for her sister. He paused. And I think she's… He stopped. She's what? Ron said, with the directness of someone who had committed to the conversation. She's the first person who's ever looked at the full size of what I am, Harry said, and not looked frightened. Silence. Oh, Hermione said softly. Yeah, Harry said. The fire crackled. Outside, the autumn wind moved against the castle's windows. Ron turned his butterbeer mug in circles on the table, thinking. Right, he said finally. So what happens now? The Goblet of Fire announces champions tomorrow night, Harry said. I'm going to be one of them. Both of them looked at him. You haven't entered, Hermione said carefully. I know, he said. Someone else is going to enter me. He'd been watching Moody with the same peripheral attention he'd given Quirrell in first year, the same quality of wrongness, the same deliberate performance of a character, and he'd been reading the thread between events all week. I don't know who yet. But someone wants me in that tournament, and it won't be because they want me to win. Then why? Ron said. Because the third task ends at a cup in a graveyard, Harry said, with the calm of someone who had thought this through. And someone needs me to get there. Another silence, longer this time. Harry, Hermione said. I know, he said. You're going to go anyway. It can't be avoided. And running from things that have to be faced is a waste of everyone's time. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the notebook she'd brought on principle, because she was Hermione Granger, and she attended every important conversation prepared. Then we prepare, she said in the voice that meant she had already begun. Tell me everything you know about the tournament's structure, he told her. The fire burned down slowly. Ron fell asleep around midnight against the arm of his chair, his butterbeer still warm, and neither of them woke him because he needed the sleep more than the information, and he'd get the summary in the morning. Sunday evening, the hall full, the goblet of fire burning its blue-white in the center of the room, and the champions being announced one by one with the theatrical certainty of something that had been arranged. Victor Crumb for Durmstrang. Fleur Delacour for Beau's Batons. Fleur walked forward when her name was called, and Harry felt the thread ring like a struck bell, not fear, not pride, something between them, an acknowledgement. She passed his table on the way to the antechamber, and her eyes found his for exactly 2 seconds, and the look in them said, very clearly, your turn. He raised an eyebrow. She moved on. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, and the hall erupted because Cedric was genuinely liked and it was right and fair, and then Dumbledore announced that the champions had been selected and the goblet was extinguished, and then the goblet lit again. The 4th slip of paper drifted down. Dumbledore caught it. Read it. And his face did something that Harry, watching with his full attention, recognized not as surprise but as the managed presentation of surprise over something that was not, in fact, surprising to the person managing the presentation. Harry Potter, Dumbledore said. Harry stood. He walked through the silent hall with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, not performing calm, just being it, and he felt the thread give a warm pulse that was distinctly worried, and he thought, in the direction of it, I know. It's all right. I've been expecting this. He didn't know if she felt that back. He walked into the antechamber. Crumb was already there, arms folded, waiting with the economy of someone comfortable with silence. Cedric was nervous in the way of someone who was brave enough but hadn't expected the stakes to triple. Fleur was standing against the far wall, and she turned when Harry walked in, and her expression moved through several things: concern, calculation, something fiercer underneath, before it settled on the particular focused composure of someone who has decided that the situation requires competence rather than reaction. "The other three are not pleased," she said quietly, when he came to stand beside her. "No," he agreed. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. Not bravado. Just fact. She studied him for a moment, that clear, direct assessment that was becoming familiar, and nodded once. "Then we deal with it," she said. The door opened and the adults came in, Dumbledore and Maxime and Karkaroff and Crouch, and the noise began, the arguing, the procedural back and forth, the competing claims of fairness and tradition. Harry stood slightly apart from it, and watched and listened and filed. Dumbledore's eyes came to him twice during the discussion, each time carrying that quality of careful watching that Harry had catalogued since first year. He looked back each time with the same even steadiness. He wasn't going to perform smallness for anyone's comfort. He wasn't afraid. He was 14 years old and carrying 5 years of compounded power, and a thread that connected him to someone who had spent those same 5 years learning everything there was to know about what he was, and he was standing in a room full of people who had planned around him without consulting him, and the feeling in his chest was not anxiety. It was something more like the feeling of a very large fire that had finally been given room. Outside, the crowd moved through the doors and the noise of the hall diminished. Inside the antechamber, the adults argued on. Harry watched Dumbledore make the case that the magical contract had to be honored, watched the careful architecture of a man who had built this entire evening toward a specific outcome, and thought, "You knew. You knew the name would come out. You arranged for this to happen, or you arranged not to prevent it, which amounts to the same thing." He filed this under confirmed concerns and updated the entry that had been running since first year. Fleur, standing at his shoulder, said nothing. But through the thread he felt her attention on Dumbledore too, sharp, evaluating, the particular quality of someone putting the same pieces together, and arriving at the same place. He turned his head slightly. She turned hers. The mutual recognition of shared conclusions passed between them in the space of a second. She gave a small nod that said, "We'll talk." He gave one back that said, "Yes. Tomorrow morning. Library." The adults finished arguing. Crouch announced the unchanged verdict. Harry Potter would compete. Harry nodded once, which made Karkaroff frown and Dumbledore study him with renewed attention, because the expected response to "you are bound by magical contract to compete in a potentially fatal tournament against your will" was not a single measured nod that suggested the information had been received and processed, and was already being incorporated into planning. He walked out of the antechamber and back into the thinning hall, and somewhere behind him he heard Fleur step out too, and the thread was warm and the fire was ready and the tournament was coming. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 4: What Champions Do the Dragon was a Hungarian horntail. Harry knew this because he'd gone to find out, which was a thing he decided he was going to do 3 days before the first task, when the thread had given him a particular quality of sharp-edged alertness that he'd come to associate with incoming information he needed. He'd followed Hagrid after curfew, not sneaking exactly, just moving quietly, which was different, and stood in the dark at the edge of the enclosure and looked at 4 dragons in 4 separate pens and made note of the species, the behavior patterns, and the specific challenge each one would present. Then he'd gone back to the castle and written it all down and gone to sleep. In the morning he told Hermione, who said, "How did you even know to go?" And he said, "Feeling." And she looked at him in the way she had when he'd explained about the thread, which was the expression of someone who had accepted that certain categories of information arrived through unconventional channels and had made her peace with that. She immediately began researching all 4 species with the thoroughness of someone who considered the word thorough to be the bare minimum. He told Fleur the morning after, in the library, and she was quiet for a moment with her notebook open in front of her. Then she said, "The thread." "Probably," he said. "The alertness quality. It happens when something requires my attention. She made a note. And my champion, she said, with a dry flatness that indicated she was not referring to herself. Madame Maxime will want me to succeed. You'll succeed, Harry said. She looked up. You don't know that. I know your theoretical framework is better than anyone else's in this tournament, he said. I know you've been training under one of the most capable Veela practitioners alive for 5 years. And I know the horntail is mine, which means you're getting something more manageable. He paused. What you need to decide is the approach. Your fire is instinct, but it's also strategy. You know how to cool it or heat it, how to direct it. That's not just a weapon, that's a communication tool. Dragons respond to fire differently than they respond to spells. She stared at him. Are you coaching me? I'm thinking out loud, he said. You can ignore it. I am not ignoring it, she said, and wrote something down. Continue. He continued. She wrote and questioned and pushed back where she had better information, which was often, and by the time the library's early morning quiet gave way to the sound of the school waking up, they had worked through a detailed approach for all 4 potential dragon scenarios, and Harry had updated his own plan 3 times based on things she'd pointed out that he hadn't considered. This was, he thought, folding his notes into his pocket and watching her gather her books with the composed efficiency of someone who did not waste motion, the most practically useful relationship he'd ever had with another person. Including Hermione, who was extraordinary but whose knowledge was bookish in a way that Fleur's wasn't. Fleur's knowledge was embodied. She understood magic from the inside, the way it felt rather than the way it was described, and the combination of her inside view and his own turned out to be something qualitatively different from either alone. He wondered sometimes whether that was the thread or just them. He was starting to think it might just be them. Cedric found him 2 days before the task, in the corridor outside the defense classroom, with the expression of someone who had been working up to something. You knew, Cedric said. Not accusatory. Just identifying a fact. Harry looked at him. About the dragons? You were there that night. Someone saw you. Cedric's expression was direct, earnest, the face of someone who operated through honesty and found it genuinely confusing when others didn't. I'm not angry. How did you know to go? Harry considered. A feeling, he said, which was the truthful short version. I was going to tell you, he added, because he had been, and hadn't gotten to it yet. I should have come to you first. Cedric processed this with the seriousness it deserved. The dragons, he said. What species? Harry told him. Cedric listened with the full attention of someone who had just been given a significant gift and knew it. When Harry finished, Cedric was quiet for a moment, then said, Why are you telling me? I'm your competition. You're not, Harry said. Someone put my name in that goblet to get me to a graveyard in June. You're Hogwarts champion. That's different from whatever I am. Cedric looked at him for a long moment. You know what the 3rd task is? Not specifically. But I know where it ends. He met Cedric's eyes. Watch yourself in the maze. If something feels wrong, it probably is. He left Cedric in the corridor and kept walking. Behind him he heard the particular silence of someone standing with new information and recalibrating what they thought the year was going to look like. The morning of the first task was gray and cold, and Harry was in the champion's tent eating an apple because the alternative was not eating, and he had a personal policy about facing large fire-breathing reptiles on an empty stomach. Crumb was doing breathing exercises in the corner, systematic and focused. Harry had decided over the past weeks of cohabiting the tournament's administrative spaces, genuinely impressive, a powerful wizard who had the rare quality of being exactly what he appeared, no performance, no pretense. Harry had a straightforward respect for that, even while noting that Crumb spent a significant amount of time looking at Fleur when she wasn't watching, which was his business and not Harry's, except that the thread occasionally gave a dry pulse when it happened that Harry translated as I noticed this and find it irrelevant but noted. Fleur was standing near the tent entrance, not eating, wrapped in her blue tournament robes, looking at something outside that was visible only to her. She had the look she got when she was running through something methodically, a particular stillness around the eyes. Cedric was the furthest from composed, not in a falling apart way but in the honest way of someone who was going to do the thing regardless, and was simply acknowledging that the thing was significant. Harry ate his apple and listened to the crowd outside and felt the horntail through the walls, or thought he did, which might have been imagination but might have been the live-wire quality of his magic reading the thermal signature of a very large living firemaker. He'd been doing things like that more often lately. Small unexpected extensions of what he could perceive. He caught Fleur looking at him from the tent entrance. She raised an eyebrow, a question. He gave a small nod. Ready. She turned back to the outside. The task judge called them in order, Crumb first, then Fleur, then Cedric, then Harry. When Fleur's turn came, Harry moved to the tent entrance and listened. Not to the crowd. The crowd was noise, general in the way of large groups, but to the quality of the magic happening 30 yards away behind canvas and wood and the temporary wooden stands. He'd found he could do this in the past months, read the texture of significant magical events at a distance the way you read weather through a window. He didn't tell anyone about this particular capability yet because he was still working out its range and reliability. He felt the moment Fleur's fire met the dragon's. The Beauxbatons' approach to the task, she'd refined it after their library sessions, refined it further on her own, was not combat. She didn't try to subdue or confuse the way Crumb's approach had been. Crumb had conjured a dense fog to confuse his dragon's sense, and retrieved the egg cleanly and quickly, pragmatic and effective. Fleur sang. Harry had known she was going to do this because she'd mentioned it 2 days ago with the matter-of-factness of someone identifying the most efficient solution. Veela fire was a communication medium for dragons in ways that human spell work wasn't. The old magic recognized the old magic. She would walk into that arena and meet the Welsh green on its own terms and ask, rather than demand. The crowd went very quiet. In the thread, he felt her focus, absolute, clear, without the static of doubt. He felt when the dragon responded, the quality of Fleur's attention shifting from concentration to something lighter, almost wondering. The crowd's silence turned into something different, something with more texture, an audience watching a thing they hadn't expected and couldn't quite categorize. Then applause. Long and full. The thread gave a warm pulse, not pride, something quieter than pride. Satisfaction. The feeling of a thing correctly done. She came back through the tent entrance with the golden egg under her arm and color in her face, and she looked at Harry as she came in and said, "The dragon and I have an understanding," with the composure of someone reporting a successful negotiation. "I heard," he said. She tilted her head. "How?" "Working on that," he said. She studied him briefly, noted whatever she needed to note, and sat down. The judge called Cedric. Harry's turn. The arena was larger than it looked from outside, because it had been expanded magically, and the horntail was at the far end of it, and she was magnificent. He'd known she was a horntail from the enclosure visit, but knowing and seeing were different. She was 40 feet of black-scaled, many-horned, narrowed-eyed specific threat, and she was sitting on a clutch of gray eggs, and she was watching him with the intelligence of something that had been alive longer than most of the wizards in the stands. He stood at the entrance to the arena for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to read the space, the layout, the distance to the golden egg at the nest's edge, the horntail's sight lines and the arc of her tail's probable motion and the angle of her flame against the wind. Then he raised his wand. Accio firebolt. He felt the charm go, not just heard it, felt it moving outward through the castle walls, through the grounds, up through the window of his dormitory where his broom had been leaning against the bedpost. The summoning charm at this distance was technically fifth-year work, which he hadn't done in class yet but had been working through independently because the theory was interesting, and what was the point of theory you weren't using? The broom came in under a minute. The crowd made a sound. He was on it before it fully stopped. The horntail tracked him. Good eyes, she had very good eyes, she was following him the way a hunter tracks something that moves unpredictably, and he was moving unpredictably because that was the point. He took her low and fast across the near edge of the arena, and she turned, and he banked hard left, and felt the heat of the flame she breathed at where he'd been. And he went up and over and came at the nest from the north, and she was already turning. He went into a Ronsky feint with 100 feet to go. Not a full one, not the kind designed to use the ground as a stopping point, a modified version, a half-dive that pulled her attention and her fire down, and then broke upward, using the thermal from her own flame as lift. And he came over her neck and stretched down, and his fingers closed on the golden egg, and he had it, and he was up again, and the horntail was very fast and very angry, and the tail came around hard. He felt it graze his ankle. Not catch, graze. Close enough that the spike sheared through his boot leather, and one scored a line across his heel, and the pain was immediate and sharp, and he tucked it into the back of his mind because he was still moving and the arena wall was coming up fast. And he pulled up and cleared it with about 6 inches to spare and heard the crowd from very close as he came around and landed. He stood on the grass outside the arena wall, golden egg under his arm, his ankle bleeding competently through his boot, and the stands were making a sound he'd never heard directed at him before, which was the sound of 10,000 people seeing something and not quite believing it yet. He looked at the scores as they went up. 9s and 10s. He walked back to the tent, favoring his ankle slightly, noting without much interest that it was going to need Madame Pomfrey's attention, and she was going to have opinions about that. Fleur met him at the tent entrance. She looked at his ankle, then at his face, then at the egg. "Ankle," she said. "It's fine. It is bleeding. Effectively fine," he said. She put her hand on his arm without preamble, and said something quietly in French that he didn't fully catch. And the warmth of it, her hand, the thread, something that was both and neither, ran briefly through the ankle, and the sharpest edge of the pain took one step back. Not healed. Eased. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "Old Veela technique," she said. "Pain management. Not healing, I am not a healer." She removed her hand with the composure of someone who has done a practical thing and doesn't require discussion of it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, looking at the scores still showing on the judge's table. "You were showing off," she said. "I was being efficient. You did the Ronsky feint over a nesting horntail. The feint was the most effective way to redirect her attention without permanent injury to either of us," he said. She looked at him. The expression was the one he was coming to think of as Fleur processing Harry, which had its own specific texture. She was reading something, weighing something, and when she finished she usually produced either a question or a conclusion. This time it was a conclusion. "You were also enjoying yourself," she said. He considered arguing. Decided against it. "A bit," he admitted. Something moved in her expression. Not the smile she kept mostly private, but its precursor, the adjustment of the corners of her mouth that meant she was deciding whether the situation warranted it. She decided it didn't warrant the full version but gave him the precursor anyway, which he found, to his own mild surprise, worth considerably more than the crowd's 10,000 people. The golden egg screamed when he opened it that night. He'd known it would scream, from the encyclopedic account Hermione had assembled about Triwizard history, but knowing and experiencing were different. He sat on his bed in the dormitory with the thing open in his hands and the sound coming out of it like the worst of all possible things, and noted that the sound had structure, pitch variation, rhythm. Not random noise. Encoded information. He closed it. Opened it again. Listened longer this time, past the initial assault, to the underlying pattern. Closed it. "Muffliato," he said, establishing the privacy charm around his section of the dormitory, and opened the egg again, and this time focused past the noise entirely and listened the way he'd been learning to listen through the thread, not with his ears exactly, with the part of him that read textures and temperatures and qualities of things. The noise resolved into, not words, not quite. An impression. Something underwater. Something about time. He closed the egg and wrote, underwater. Gillyweed or bubblehead charm. Something taken. Return it within the hour. He thought about something taken for a long time. Then he added people. They'll take people. Find out who before the task. He sat with that for a moment. The coldness of it, not the task itself, he wasn't particularly afraid of the task, but the particular mechanism of taking people he cared about as leverage was the kind of thing that made the fire in his chest run hot. He thought about Ron, who had fallen asleep in the common room armchair. He thought about Hermione, who had been walking back to the library when he'd come up to bed. He thought about the quality of the tournament's design so far, the willingness to use people as components. His jaw tightened. He wrote one more line: protect them before the task if possible. Early information is the only lever. Then he wrote in the margin, smaller, tell Fleur. He told Fleur the next morning. She was ahead of him, he found. She'd worked out the underwater element already, had cracked the egg 2 nights prior using a translation approach she'd developed from old Mermish texts in the Beauxbatons library. She'd been sitting on the information, she said, working out the implications. The hostages, Harry said. Yes. Her voice was controlled. They will take someone from each champion. Who would they take from you? Gabrielle. She said it without inflection, which was more informative than inflection would have been. Gabrielle was 3 years old in Fleur's story of the Rite. She was 8 now, had traveled with the Beauxbatons delegation, was somewhere in the castle. She is the most obvious choice. Then she needs to not be obvious, Harry said. She needs to be somewhere that's more complicated to reach than her current location. Fleur looked at him. You are suggesting we move the hostages preemptively. I'm suggesting we make sure the people we care about are aware of what's coming and have some agency in managing it. Which is different from the tournament's design, which is to take that agency entirely. He paused. If they can't find Gabrielle easily, they'll try someone else or adjust the timing. Either gives us information, or they will escalate, she said. Possibly. He agreed. But I'd rather deal with an escalated threat I can see coming than a hidden threat I can't. She was quiet, running the calculations he could feel moving through the thread as a particular quality of focused processing. Then, there is also Madame Maxime to consider. She will not want her students at risk. Tell her some of it, Harry said. Not the source, the conclusion. You worked it out from the egg, which is true. She doesn't need to know I helped. Fleur gave him a look. She will need to know about you eventually. Eventually is fine, he said. Eventually isn't today. She thought about this. Then she did something he hadn't seen from her before. She laughed. Brief and genuine, surprised out of her by something in the situation's specific absurdity. It changed her face considerably, the way his full smile changed his. He filed the laugh somewhere more careful than his usual filing system. What? He said. Nothing, she said, which clearly meant something. I am simply, this is not how I thought this conversation would go. Any of these conversations. She gestured at the space between them, which was the gesture of someone indicating not the library table but everything the library table had come to represent. I thought I would meet you and feel guilty and explain and you would be. She stopped. What? He said again, more quietly. I thought you might be angry, she said. Properly angry. About all of it, the Rite, the fact that it happened without consent, the years of not knowing. She met his eyes. I spent a significant amount of time between age 9 and age 17 working out how to manage that conversation. He thought about the 5 years of careful preparation he'd felt through the thread, the concentration, the worry, the long planning quality of someone building toward a specific moment. He thought about the girl who'd picked up a very old book and read it, and decided that she would learn everything there was to know about what she'd done, because it was the only responsible response to doing it. I was angry for 5 minutes, he said. I told Hermione that. 5 minutes, she said, with an expression that wasn't quite disbelief but was adjacent. You were 9, he said. Your magic was frightened for someone you loved and it reached out. That's, he thought about it. That's not something you're responsible for in the way that would make anger useful. You were also the one who made it right afterwards. Spent 5 years learning what it was, what it did, what it meant. That's not the action of someone who did a thoughtless thing and moved on. Fleur looked at him for a long moment. The thread was very quiet, doing the thing it did occasionally when something significant was happening that didn't need amplification. I want to tell you something, she said. All right. What you are. She paused, selecting the words. What the Rite found. I have felt it for 5 years through the thread. Not completely, not specifically, but enough. And I want you to know that from the first time I was old enough to understand what I was feeling, I was not frightened of it. She held his gaze. I thought it was extraordinary. I thought, whoever this is, this person my magic found, they are remarkable, and I did not destroy something by reaching out to them, I found something. She stopped. I wanted you to know that. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said, and meant it in the full depth of the word, which was a depth he didn't usually make visible. She nodded once, and opened her notebook, and they went back to work. The weeks between the first and second task had their own structure. The tournament's official functions, the Yule Ball, the daily architecture of a school year running parallel to everything else. The Yule Ball was straightforward for Harry in the way that things were straightforward when you decided not to make them complicated. He'd asked Parvati Patil because she was a good dancer, and would have a better time with someone who was actually attending rather than suffering through it, and he'd been honest with her about that in a way that she'd apparently found refreshingly direct because she'd said yes immediately, and seemed to mean it. He danced 3 dances with Parvati, and had a genuine conversation with her about divination, which he didn't take but she did, and she had interesting things to say about it. And then he spent the rest of the evening doing what he did at every large gathering, which was to move through it methodically and pay attention. Fleur was there with Roger Davies, who was treating the evening with the dazed quality of someone who had been to every dance he'd ever been to and had never previously had an experience that reset the baseline. Harry noted this, and noted the thread's mild dry commentary on it, and kept moving. He talked to Crumb, who was there with Hermione and visibly more comfortable in conversation than in the crowd's attention. Crumb was a private person in the specific way of someone who had been made famous young and had learned to maintain an interior that fame couldn't reach. Harry liked him better for it. They talked, of all things, about flying, not competitive flying, not Quidditch specifics, but the experience of it, what it felt like, what it gave you. It was the most genuine conversation Harry had at the ball. He caught Fleur's eye across the room at one point, and she gave him the small nod that had come to mean I'm paying attention and will discuss later, and he returned it. At some point after midnight he found himself on the stone steps outside the hall's main entrance, which was cold and clear and quiet relative to the noise behind him, and he sat on the steps and looked at the grounds in the darkness and thought about the graveyard. He'd been thinking about the graveyard with increasing frequency. Not with dread, with the focused attention of someone approaching a known obstacle. Someone wanted him there. That someone was also in this building, moving around him, attending the same events. He'd narrowed it considerably since first year. Not Quirrell anymore, Quirrell was gone, but the same quality of wrongness, the same performed character. He had a name he was working toward but not quite there yet. He heard footsteps on the stone behind him, and didn't need to look. The thread told him. Fleur sat beside him on the step with the comfortable directness of someone who has decided that performing hesitation is a waste of both their time. She'd taken her hair down at some point and it was loose, silver in the starlight, and she was carrying her shoes in one hand because the dancing had apparently been thorough. Davies? He said. A very nice person, she said, which was the complete review. Who is not the point of this evening? She looked at the grounds. You have been thinking about the third task. Yes. So have I. A pause. Harry. I want to ask you something directly. All right. Someone put your name in the goblet to bring you to a specific place in June, she said. You know this. I know this. It means the tournament is also a trap. Yes. And you intend to walk into it anyway. I intend to get there before the person who said it does, he said. Which is different. She was quiet for a moment. The grounds were silver and dark and very still. Is it possible to prepare for something when you don't know its full shape? You prepare for everything you can see, he said, and you keep enough space to adapt to everything you can't. He paused. The thread helps with the adapting part. She turned to look at him directly, which put her close enough that he could see the particular gray of her eyes clearly, which was unusual for nighttime and meant the thread was doing something with light again. It did that occasionally and he'd stopped being surprised by it. I will be in the stands for the third task, she said. Bosbaton's champions who don't complete the second task don't participate in the third. You'll complete the second task, he said. I know I will, she said, with no uncertainty. I am saying, I will be in the stands. Not in the maze with you. She held his gaze. If something goes wrong, I know, he said. The thread I know, he said again, more quietly. I'll feel it. And so will you. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and the look in it was something he'd started to recognize. Not fear, she didn't do fear the way other people did, but the specific expression of someone who has something they value and is honest enough with themselves to acknowledge that the valuing is real and the vulnerability that comes with it is real. He held it back at her. He didn't look away or minimize or file. All right, she said after a moment. All right, he agreed. They sat on the stone steps in the cold and looked at the grounds, and the thread ran warm and steady between them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence had the quality of something built rather than absent. The second task arrived in February with all the warmth of a Scottish loch in winter, which is to say none. Harry stood at the water's edge and felt the cold coming off the surface and thought about what was down there, the mere people, the hostages, the hour. He'd had gillyweed from Dobby, which was a separate concern he'd been managing since Christmas when he'd realized the elf had information about the tasks that was worth pursuing, and he held it in his fist and waited for the cannon. Beside him, Fleur stood very still. He'd wondered how to handle this. The hostage element, Gabrielle specifically, which was real and not something the tournament was going to be talked out of despite his and Fleur's earlier planning. The planning had yielded some intelligence about timing and confirmed their suspicion about the mechanism. It had not changed the fundamental fact that Gabrielle was at the bottom of the lake. She will be fine, he said, not looking at Fleur. She will be fine, Fleur repeated, with the tone of someone running a necessary program. I'll find her if you get there first, he said. She turned her head to look at him. You will not, she said. You will find your own person and come back. I'll find my person and come back, he agreed. And if there's time, I'll find Gabrielle. Harry, Fleur. He met her eyes. Be what you are. All of it. He echoed the parchment deliberately and watched her register it, the slight widening, the recognition. Go get your sister. The cannon fired. He put the gillyweed in his mouth and went in. The lake was cold and dark, and then, as the gillyweed took hold, cold and dark and clear, and he was moving through it with the ease of something that had stopped being human enough to find water hostile. He went down and forward and found the shapes in the water more by the thread's spatial awareness than by sight. He was developing a troubling tendency to navigate by the same low-frequency sensing that read people's magic at distance, and underwater it was actually useful. He moved fast. He found the hostages in 17 minutes. Ron, tied to a stone statue at the lake bed, hair drifting, asleep in the not-quite-sleeping way of someone held under a charm. Hermione beside him. Gabrielle Delacour 3 statues to the left, very small, very still. He cut Ron free. He started on Hermione's ropes and then heard a sound behind him that he recognized, a wrong-direction pressure in the water, and turned to find a Grindylow with ambitions larger than its size. He dealt with the Grindylow with the same practical economy he brought to everything and freed Hermione, and felt Ron beginning to drift upward. He looked at Gabrielle. Her ropes were still intact. No other champion had been near the bottom yet. He'd have felt the disruption in the water. He told Fleur he would find his person and come back. He told Fleur, if there's time. He cut Gabrielle's ropes. He came up with all 3 of them, which took more from him physically than just the 2 would have, and surfaced in the chop and noise of the lake's surface with the crowd's sound coming in on him, and got all three to the platform, and Ron sputtered to life and said bloody cold, with characteristic precision. Hermione threw her arms around Harry, which he tolerated because she was wet and freezing and he was both those things too, and the shared temperature made it less awkward. He looked at the platform where Fleur should be. She wasn't there. The thread gave a quality he hadn't felt before, a particular sharp alertness, not fear but its immediate neighbor, the sensation of something being wrong in a way that required attention. Then she broke the surface 40 feet away, pulling herself through the water with the mechanical determination of someone who has used most of their resources and is running on the last reserves of something more fundamental than magic. She came to the platform and a marshal helped her up, and she stood there dripping and breathing in the deep way of someone who'd had their lungs pressed, and she was looking around. Harry held up Gabrielle. Fleur went very still. He swam the girl over and transferred her to the marshal on the platform and climbed up himself, and Fleur crossed the distance in 2 steps and took Gabrielle from the marshal without looking at anyone else, and stood there holding her 8-year-old sister with her face pressed into pale silver hair, silent, breathing. Harry stood nearby and said nothing and gave her the space the moment required. After a minute Gabrielle stirred, the charm wearing off, life returning, and said something in French that was clearly sleepy and confused. Fleur said something back, very quietly, that Harry didn't catch but that made Gabrielle put her arms around her sister's neck and go still again. Fleur looked up at Harry over Gabrielle's head. Her eyes were wet, which might have been the lake. He thought it was probably not the lake. "You went back for her," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "If there was time." "You lost time on your score." He shrugged. "The score doesn't matter." She looked at him for a moment longer. The thread was very warm. The lake was very cold. Around them the tournament's machinery was grinding back into motion, scores being announced, crowds moving, the next stage of the year beginning its approach. She said his name once, quietly, and the way she said it meant something he didn't have precise words for yet but intended to understand better in due course. He said her name back, in the same register. Gabrielle opened her eyes and looked at Harry with the unguarded directness of an 8-year-old. "You are the one," she said in accented English, clear as a bell. "Gabrielle," Fleur said. "Grandmere said there is one," Gabrielle said, apparently untroubled by Fleur's warning tone. "She said Fleur found him." "You are him, yes?" Harry looked at this 8-year-old with her silver hair and her enormous eyes and her complete absence of diplomacy. He thought, this is what Fleur was like at 8, before anyone taught her that directness was inconvenient. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." Gabrielle studied him with the seriousness of a child making an important assessment. Then she nodded once, with the finality of someone who has concluded a verification process to their satisfaction, and turned back to Fleur. Fleur met Harry's eyes over her sister's head with an expression that was mortified and amused and something else she wasn't ready to name yet. He felt the same something else. He let it be. The scores came, 47 points for Harry, which put him tied for first. He heard the number and noted it and moved on, because the scores were the tournament's story and the tournament's story was not the one that mattered. The one that mattered was the graveyard in June. He started planning for it on the way back to the castle, walking beside Fleur who was carrying Gabrielle on her back, through the crowd that parted for them without quite knowing why, under the gray February sky that was moving towards spring. He had 4 months. That was enough. Chapter 5. The graveyard and the fire. The maze arrived in June like something that had always been inevitable. Harry stood at the entrance with the other champions, Cedric to his left, Crumb to his right, Fleur back at the starting line because she'd placed 4th in the aggregate points and would enter last, and looked at the hedgerows that were 20 feet tall and moving slightly in a wind that didn't exist, and he thought about 4 months of preparation and whether 4 months was enough. It was enough, he decided. Not because he'd covered everything. You couldn't cover everything, that was the lesson of every task so far, but because he'd covered everything he could see, and he'd left enough space for the things he couldn't. That was the principle. That was what you had. Behind him, in the stands, 10,000 people made the kind of noise that was more texture than sound at this distance. He didn't try to find Fleur in it. He could feel her through the thread, the particular quality of her attention, sharp and comprehensive, the focused watchfulness of someone who has spent 4 months building toward this moment, and is now in the one position she cannot act from. He'd felt that quality building for weeks. The specific frustration of someone who understands a situation completely, and cannot be the one to walk into it. He understood it. He didn't try to talk her out of it because it was honest and real and the right response to the thing they both knew was at the end of this maze. He felt her now, steady, focused. The thread doing what it did in high-stakes moments, which was to run very clear and very warm, like a wire with good current. The cannon fired. He went in. The maze had its own intelligence. He'd expected this. Magical constructs developed a kind of situational logic when given sufficient time and intent, and the Triwizard Maze had been designed by someone who wanted champions to be separated and tested, and he had a strong working theory about who that someone was. Not Dumbledore. Not in this specific architecture. The person who designed this maze's specific logic had wanted particular outcomes, and Harry moved through it with his attention split between the obstacles in front of him and the pattern of those obstacles, because patterns told you more than individual events. First 20 minutes, a blast-ended scrut he redirected sideways using a barrier charm and his own movement rather than fighting it, because fighting a blast-ended scrut in an enclosed space was bad geometry. A boggart that tried to become a Dementor and meta-ridiculous that he fired before it fully formed, because he'd learned in 3rd year that Dementors were better approached with warmth than fear and the principle applied to their imitations. A section of hedge that had been spelled to close on anyone moving through it, which he identified by the particular stillness of the air and walked through running rather than slowly. The pattern was, everything wanted to stop him. Not test him. Stop him. That was information. 30 minutes in, the thread gave a sharp pull to the left. Not a warning exactly, the thread didn't do specific warnings, it wasn't a navigation system. It was more like the quality of attention you feel from someone who is watching and has seen something. He went left at the next junction. Found Cedric. Cedric was down, not unconscious but barely not, his wand arm limp and his face set in the expression of someone dealing with pain through the specific mechanism of refusing to acknowledge it. Stunner residue around him, strong, recent, professionally aimed. Crumb, Cedric said before Harry asked. Not himself. Eyes wrong. Like the moody thing. Harry processed this in 3 seconds, crumb under the Imperius, taken out of the competition's legitimate run, which meant someone needed the maze clear. Down to 2 champions. He thought about Cedric's information from before the first task, the warning he'd given about the 3rd task feeling wrong, the way Cedric had carried that knowledge through 4 months without telling anyone who shouldn't know. Can you move? Harry said. Yes. Cedric proved it by standing, which took more from him than he let show. I'm not out. You need to be out, Harry said. Not because you can't handle it, you can. Because whoever is running this show needs us both at the cup, and I need you not to be there. Cedric looked at him steadily. You know what's at the end. A portkey, Harry said. And what comes after? I've known for months. Get to the edge of the maze and fire red sparks. Get disqualified. Live. A long pause. Cedric's jaw was doing something tight and complicated, the expression of a genuinely brave person deciding between 2 kinds of courage. What's at the other end of the portkey? A graveyard, Harry said. And Voldemort. The name landed. Cedric held. Why are you telling me? Cedric said. You could have let me keep going. You might need a second person, I don't. Harry said. I need you alive. You're a good person and a good wizard and you're going to do important things, and none of those things happen if you get to a graveyard tonight. He said it simply, without decoration. Fire the sparks, Cedric. Cedric looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face, a decision, the full weight of it, coming down on one side with the finality of a person who has chosen the harder option and is at peace with it. "Come back," Cedric said. "Planning on it," Harry said, and moved. The cup was in a clearing at the maze's center, on a plinth that had been grown from the hedge itself, blue-white and pulsing with the particular quality of a portkey that was live and waiting. Harry stood at the clearing's edge and looked at it, and felt the trap in the air the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Everything about the clearing was designed to make you walk toward it without thinking. The cup's light. The clearing itself, open after the maze's confinement, a relief after 20 meters of walls. The sense of completion, of ending, after an hour of difficulty. He stood at the edge and didn't move and read the trap instead. The portkey was real. The destination was real. The graveyard waited. He thought about options. He thought about refusing to touch it, which had a certain logical appeal but which he'd already considered and rejected months ago, because refusing didn't stop the person who'd built this, it just delayed them, and delay was worse than confrontation when the confrontation was survivable. He thought about modifying the portkey, which he'd been working on and which was theoretically possible but practically uncertain. He thought about going through and having resources on the other side, which was the plan he'd built for 4 months. Because the plan had never been to avoid the graveyard. The plan had been to be ready for it. He was ready for it. He thought about Fleur in the stands and felt the thread, still clear, still warm, still the particular focused watchfulness of someone who cannot act and is holding that still. He walked into the clearing and picked up the cup. The graveyard was exactly what graveyards were at midnight, cold, still, smelling of old stone and cut grass and something else that wasn't organic. A chemical edge to the air that Harry's magic identified as preparation, as spell work laid in advance. He landed on his feet, which took some doing given the portkey's particular spin, and stood up and read the space immediately. Headstones. Large ones, older than the town they probably served, the kind of stone that had been here long enough to grow its own small ecology of lichen and moss. A path between them, lit by nothing but the overcast sky's ambient light and his own low-level magic sensing the ambient heat signatures. At the end of the path, a large stone grave marker with something tied to it. A shape. Wrapped in robes. And Peter Pettigrew stepping out from behind the nearest headstone with a bundle in his arms and his face doing all of the things guilty faces do when they pass the point of return and are now committed to a course they cannot walk back from. Harry had his wand up before Pettigrew finished stepping clear of the stone. "Don't," Harry said. "Conversational." "Clear." Pettigrew stopped. The bundle in his arms moved, a movement Harry had half expected and found no less repellent for the expectation. He looked at the bundle. He looked at Pettigrew. He thought about the specific alchemy of this moment. A man who had killed James and Lily Potter standing in a graveyard holding the remains of the person who'd ordered it done. "You've been very clever," said a voice from the bundle. "Hi." Cold. The voice of something that had been reduced to its most essential components, and found that what remained was nothing that a human being would want to be. "Not especially," Harry said. "Your plan had about 4 obvious weak points." A pause. "Confident. Realistic," Harry said. "You needed me here specifically. That tells me something about what you can and can't do without me. Whatever comes next requires my blood. Which means you need me alive for some portion of what follows." He kept his wand on Pettigrew, and tracked the shape in Pettigrew's arms with his peripheral awareness. "That's a constraint. A temporary one," said the voice. "Most constraints are," Harry agreed. He was running the arithmetic of the space, which was what he did in high-stakes situations. Every problem was a spatial one if you reduced it correctly. Pettigrew was the variable. The thing in the bundle was currently dependent. The grave marker with the wrapped shape needed to be dealt with, but that was secondary to managing what was mobile. He thought about the thread, bright and clear in his chest, and thought about what he knew and what he was about to learn and how much time he needed to get back. He'd given this a lot of thought over 4 months. He said Incarcerus and Accio wand simultaneously, which wasn't technically standard casting, but he'd been doing non-standard casting since he was 11 and the mechanics were solid. Ropes flew from the wand tip and wrapped Pettigrew mid-movement, taking him off his feet, and the bundle tumbled and Harry was already crossing the space. The bundle hit the ground and began something that he'd read about, but that was still, in practice, deeply unpleasant to witness. The preparation that had been laid into the graveyard activated the cauldron, the fire, the old blood magic that was doing what it was designed to do regardless of whether anyone was actively directing it, because the magic was in the space and had been building for hours. Harry backed up. He couldn't stop the ritual. That was the thing he'd had to make peace with in his planning. You couldn't interrupt blood magic mid-sequence without consequences that were worse than the original event. That was basic dark arts theory that Hermione had written him a thorough summary of and that the library's restricted section had confirmed. What you could do was manage what came after. He stood in the graveyard and breathed and felt the cold press of the space and the warmth of the thread and kept his wand ready and waited. The cauldron's light went white. Then it went out. And Voldemort stepped out of the dark. He was tall. That was the first thing, the detail that the history books and the whispered accounts never quite conveyed, the actual physical reality of him, which was tall and pale and wrong in the way of something that had been taken apart and put back together by someone who understood the components, but had lost the original instructions. The face was flat, the eyes were red, the hands were long-fingered and reaching for the wand that Pettigrew, struggling free of the ropes that Harry noted had held longer than expected, was bringing to him. Voldemort looked at Harry. Harry looked at Voldemort. Between them, 12 feet of graveyard in the dark. "Harry Potter," Voldemort said, with the satisfaction of someone arriving somewhere they have been planning to arrive for 13 years. "Tom Riddle," Harry said. The air in the graveyard went very still. It was the name, which was the most honest description of what he was facing, not a title, not a myth, not the thing of whispers. A person who had made specific choices, named and therefore finite. Harry had thought about that too. The power of calling something what it was. Voldemort's expression moved through something fast. Not quite anger, more the specific response of someone whose frame has been challenged before they've fully established it, who knows the challenge is deliberate. "Crucio," he said, almost experimentally. Harry was already moving. Not because he'd predicted the specific curse, but because standing still when facing someone who intended to harm you was bad spatial management, and he'd spent 4 months thinking about what movement in this space looked like. The curse hit the headstone behind him and the stone fissured and he kept moving, putting 2 more headstones between them, and fired a stunner and a reductor simultaneously from opposite angles of the same wand movement, which was a thing he'd been developing for 3 months and that had a non-trivial success rate. Voldemort deflected both with something that wasn't technically a shield charm but functioned as one, older, more structural, the kind of defensive work that had been built when wizarding combat operated on different foundations. "You've been practicing," Voldemort said. "You've been in a graveyard getting reconstituted for an hour," Harry said, keeping moving, reading the space. "I've had a year and a half." He fired again, not at Voldemort directly, at the cauldron, which was still active and hot, and which exploded with a sound that was structural rather than merely loud, the sound of something designed for contained power becoming suddenly uncontained. Pettigrew went down. Shrapnel scattered across the graveyard. Voldemort moved with the speed of something that had once been genuinely excellent at magic, before the Horcruxes and the resurrections and the cost of having taken himself apart so many times, and he was fast, but not as fast as he had been, and Harry could feel that in the quality of his movements. Harry noted it. Filed it. The Death Eaters arrived through the graveyard's gate with the delayed quality of people who had been waiting for a signal and found the signal ambiguous because the scene was not what they'd been told to expect. 12 of them, massed, forming a loose circle. Voldemort raised a hand and they stopped. He wanted this, Harry read. He wanted this specific. He wanted an audience for a specific thing. "You cannot win," Voldemort said, with the tone of someone stating a fact. "You might survive if I permit it. But you cannot win." "I'm not trying to win tonight," Harry said. A pause. Then what are you trying to do? Understand you, Harry said, which was the truth, and he watched Voldemort process it and find it wrong, because Voldemort's experience of people was that they feared him or wanted things from him or both, and someone who wanted to understand him without a specific agenda fell outside the available categories. You're not what I expected. I have been called many things, Voldemort said. I have not been called expected. You're afraid, Harry said. The air went wrong again, and this time it was personal. This was the specific wrongness of a very private truth being said in front of 12 witnesses. Voldemort moved and Harry moved too, and the next 30 seconds were quick and ugly, and the most technically demanding combat Harry had encountered, because Voldemort at reduced capacity was still considerably more dangerous than anything else Harry had faced. And he took a glancing hit from something that wasn't the Cruciatus but was in the same family, and felt it in every nerve he had simultaneously before he got his shield up properly. He got his shield up. It held. He was breathing hard now. His hands were steady. He thought, this is survivable. This is absolutely survivable. I have what I need. Because he did. He'd spent 4 months asking the right questions and the graveyard had answered them. The Horcruxes, he'd known about the concept from Hermione's research into dark magic preservation, had suspected the mechanism since second year when the diary had done what it had done, had confirmed his theory tonight in the quality of Voldemort's magic, which had the specific texture of something that had been divided and reconnected and divided again until the connections were stretched past their designed load. He could feel the incompleteness of it. The way Voldemort's magic reached for something that wasn't fully there. He knew what had to happen. Not tonight. Tonight was about getting back. But he knew the shape of the thing, and knowing the shape was everything. He said priori incantatem with a specific intention behind it, because the wand connection was real and documented, and he'd read Ollivander's notes on the subject when he'd visited the shop in 4th year to have his wand weighed for the tournament. He knew what the brother wands would do. He'd been planning to use it since he confirmed the wand connection in 2nd year. The golden thread appeared between the wands. Voldemort felt it immediately. The connection pulled at something he hadn't experienced since he'd last held this sensation 13 years ago, the echo of the magic that had rebounded on him in a nursery in Godric's Hollow. His concentration fractured precisely enough. The thread between the wands built into the priori effect, and the echoes of his last spells began to emerge, and Harry bore down on the thread with everything he had, with 5 years of compounded resonance, and 3 years of a school that had been consistently unable to contain him, and the thread held. The shades appeared. His parents. Cedric, thankfully not here in reality, just the echo of the near miss on Crumb's action tonight. Others. He heard his mother's voice from the echo and pressed everything he had into the thread and said one word, very quietly, that wasn't a spell name. Now. The echoes converged on Voldemort, not attacking, they couldn't attack, they were echoes, but covering, giving him 5 seconds, which was all he needed. He summoned the portkey. It came, he'd modified it before entering the maze, exactly as he'd planned, adjusted its anchor point rather than its destination so that it would respond to a summoning charm from the destination's site. This was the technical part he'd been least sure of, and it worked exactly as he'd hoped, and he had 3 Death Eaters breaking from the circle toward him, and he was already moving and his hand was on the cup, and the graveyard went. The standing stones of Hogwarts grounds came in. He hit the grass hard, rolled, came up on one knee with his wand out and nobody around him because the portkey had deposited him 50 feet from the maze entrance, and the crowd hadn't processed the fact that someone was back yet. He knelt in the grass and breathed. His hands were shaking. He noted this with the clinical detachment of someone observing their own physical state and found it acceptable. Shaking hands after combat was a physiological response, not a failure of composure. He breathed through it and felt the thread and followed it back to himself, because the thread was always there when he needed to locate where he was, not just physically. The thread was moving. Not the steady warm current. Moving. Pulling. The thread was pulling toward him from somewhere at the ground's edge, crossing distance with a velocity that was not metaphorical, and he looked up. Fleur was running. Not walking quickly, not moving through the crowd with purposeful urgency. Running, flat out, across the castle grounds, silver hair flying behind her, and she'd cleared the stands somehow and was on the grass and covering distance with the single-minded efficiency of someone who had felt something through a thread and had started moving before their conscious mind finished forming the decision. Behind her, he could hear Madame Maxime calling her name. He could hear the general noise of the crowd processing the fact that a champion had returned and the cup was on the ground and the champion was alone and kneeling. He could hear the distant sound of marshals beginning to respond. None of it was the thing that mattered. The thread gave a resonance that was different from anything he'd felt before, not the warm, steady hum of distance, not the sharp alertness of shared attention. This was something that needed a different word, something that was the thread and also more than the thread, that was 5 years of silver fire running between two people who had been growing toward each other since they were children and had finally closed enough distance that the growing was real rather than potential. He was still kneeling in the grass when she reached him, and she dropped to her knees in front of him and her hands were on his face before she'd finished stopping, and he let her because the touch was, he didn't have words for what the touch was after that graveyard, after that cold, after that long, careful hour of being exactly what he was in a place designed to end him. Warm. Real. The warmth of a specific person rather than the general warmth of the thread. "You're hurt," she said, her hands moving from his face to his arms, the same practical assessment she'd done at the first task but more thorough. "I'm all right," he said. "The curse hit you," glancing. "I had the shield up mostly." He looked at her. Her face was, he filed the expression carefully, the specific combination of relief and something he recognized from the thread but had never seen on her face directly. He said, "I'm all right, Fleur." She sat back slightly on her heels, not removing her hands entirely, and looked at him with the full weight of those gray eyes, and she was breathing hard from the run and the thread was so loud he thought surely the people moving toward them across the grass could hear it. "You were going to tell me it was survivable," she said. "For 4 months. Every time it was survivable," he said. "You didn't know that. I had a very strong working theory." Her expression made several rapid movements. She looked, briefly, like she was going to say something very pointed about working theories, and then she looked like she was going to say something else entirely, and then she settled on a third thing that was either of those and said, "What happened?" "He's back," Harry said. "Properly. Body, wand, everything." He watched her face process that. The Death Eaters were there. Pettigrew was there. "He's going to move quickly, he'll want to re-establish before anyone can organize a response." He paused. "I know what has to happen to end it. Not tonight. There are steps. But I know." She looked at him steadily. "The Horcruxes." He blinked. "You knew?" "I suspected. The quality of what you described, the texture of the magic, it was consistent with a fractured soul working to reconstitute. The dark arts theory follows from there." She said it matter-of-factly, which he would have found funny in any other moment. "I didn't want to say it in case I was wrong." "You weren't wrong." "I'm not wrong often," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, just an honest accounting. Then her hands on his arms tightened slightly. "Harry." "Yes." "When you were in there," she said, and her voice shifted, the composed neutral dropping a register to something more interior. "I felt." She stopped. "I know what you felt," he said quietly. "When the curse hit, I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The first of the marshals was closing distance across the grass, 50 feet away, and Dumbledore was behind them moving with the urgency of someone who had not expected this particular outcome and was recalculating rapidly. Harry watched them come with peripheral vision and kept his attention on Fleur. "When the curse hit," she said, finishing the sentence she'd started. "I was on my feet and moving before I understood I was moving." She met his eyes. "That has never happened to me before. I am not a person who moves without understanding why." "No," he said. "You're not." "So," she said. He looked at her in the dark of the Hogwarts grounds, with Dumbledore closing distance and Maxime calling her name and the machinery of the wizarding world about to land on both of them with all of its weight, and he thought about the second parchment from when he was 11, the constellation drawing, two shapes being drawn toward each other. He thought about 5 years of a warm thread in his sternum. He thought about the girl in Tesco who had stumbled when he stumbled, about the Beaux Vuitton's carriage and 50 feet and everything that had passed without words between them. He thought, be what you are. All of it. So, he said, and covered her hands with his where they still rested on his arms. The thread gave a resonance that wasn't about magic at all, or was about magic in the oldest possible sense, in the sense that the word meant before it got complicated. She looked at their hands. Then at his face. The precursor to the smile appeared and this time became the thing itself, the full version, the one that changed her face so considerably. He thought it was worth considerably more than 10,000 people. The marshals reached them. Dumbledore's expression, when he reached them 30 seconds later, was the most genuinely complex thing Harry had seen on his face in 4 years of watching it carefully. He took in the scene, Harry on the grass, grounded and present, Fleur kneeling beside him in the Beaux Vuitton's blue of a champion who had cleared the stands and crossed the grounds at a flat run in direct violation of several tournament protocols, and his face did the work of processing something that his planning had not accounted for. Harry, he said, with a careful warmth that was always warm and always careful. Thank heaven. He's back, Harry said, which stopped everything. Dumbledore's face went entirely still. Tom Riddle, Harry said, because he was going to call it what it was until everyone else did too. Full body. The ritual in the Gaunt family plot. I have the specific location, Little Hangleton. The Death Eaters who were there. He'd been cataloging faces during the combat, filed, ready to deliver. Pettigrew was the instrument. Bartemius Crouch Jr. has been impersonating Mad-Eye Moody all year under Polyjuice. That's how my name got in the goblet, that's how the tasks were managed. He paused. Moody is probably in his own trunk. The locking sequence should be checked. The silence lasted 3 full seconds, which was long for Dumbledore. You've known about Crouch, Dumbledore said. It wasn't quite a question. I've had a working theory for 6 weeks, Harry said. I needed confirmation before naming someone. The graveyard confirmed it. You went into the maze knowing this. I went into the maze knowing that someone needed me at the Cup's destination and that the most efficient way to get useful information about their capabilities and resources was to be there, Harry said levelly. Staying out of it wasn't stopping anything. It was just delaying a confrontation with a less informed participant. Dumbledore looked at him. The careful warmth was still there, but behind it something else was operating, an adjustment, a revision, the ongoing recalibration of a man who had planned extensively for a certain version of Harry Potter and kept encountering a different one. You should have come to me, Dumbledore said. With a theory? Harry said. You would have managed it. Structured it. Put me somewhere in the plan where I could be useful in the way you'd determined I should be useful. He kept his voice even. With respect, that's not how I work. The air between them had a specific quality. Not hostility. Harry genuinely didn't feel hostile toward Dumbledore, had never felt hostile, because the man was not malicious. He was something more complicated than malicious and therefore more interesting to navigate. The quality was clearer than hostility. It was two people being honest about the nature of their relationship for the first time. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Fleur, who was sitting back now but not far back, present and attentive with the expression of someone following every word. Then back at Harry. You've told Miss Delacour, he said. She worked most of it out herself, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at Fleur again, and something in his assessment shifted. She registered on him as more than a witness. Harry saw him recognize that, saw the moment when Fleur moved from background to relevant party in Dumbledore's framework. Fleur met Dumbledore's gaze with the same steady composure she brought to everything and said nothing, because she was choosing what to give and what to keep, and this was not the moment to give the full picture to someone whose management impulse was still active. Harry thought, she understands him already. 4 months of him describing Dumbledore's qualities, and she'd understood before they'd been in the same room. The Crouch situation, Harry said, returning to practical things, needs handling tonight. Before he knows I got back. Dumbledore pulled himself back to the present moment with the ease of someone practiced at managing multiple things simultaneously. Yes, he said. Severus. He was already turning. Then he stopped and looked back at Harry. I would like to speak with you fully. Tomorrow. I'll be in the hospital wing, Harry said. Madame Pomfrey is going to have opinions about the graze on my heel and probably everything else. Something crossed Dumbledore's face that was, underneath all the management, genuine. I'm very glad you're back, he said, and it was the most unguarded thing Harry had heard from him in 4 years. I told Cedric I was planning on it, Harry said. Dumbledore left. The marshals were organizing, people were moving, the machinery was engaging. Madame Pomfrey arrived from the general direction of the medical tent at a pace that suggested she'd been waiting for casualties and had strong feelings about being made to wait this long. She took one look at Harry and made the sound she always made, which communicated clinical concern, professional exasperation, and personal fondness in a combination that was uniquely hers. Hospital wing, she said. Yes, Harry said and stood. His legs were fine. His hands had stopped shaking. The glancing curse hit was a bruising sensation across his ribs that would need attention and that he was fully prepared to allow. Fleur stood when he stood and she was at his shoulder, not supporting him, just present, and he didn't tell her she didn't need to come because she clearly knew whether she needed to come or not, and had made her own decision. Pomfrey looked at Fleur. Then at Harry. Then at the thread, which wasn't visible to anyone but which the experienced witch clearly felt the edge of, in the way experienced witches felt the edges of significant magical things. She asked no questions. Both of you, then, she said, with the air of someone noting this for their records, and led the way. They walked across the grounds in the June night, the castle lit up ahead of them, the grounds still full of the managed chaos of a tournament ending in ways nobody had anticipated. Fleur walked beside him and their arms were close enough that the thread ran between them in a warm low register, no longer the deafening resonance of crisis, back to something that was its truest version, constant, clear, a frequency that had been running since he was 8 years old in a cupboard and would, he suspected, run for considerably longer than that. He thought about what came next. The Horcruxes. The work. The specific shape of everything between now and the end of it. He thought about Dumbledore, who was going to have to revise his planning significantly, and who would find that both harder and easier than he expected. He thought about a wizarding world that was about to discover that it had a war coming and a chosen one who was not going to perform the role they'd written for him. He thought about all of it with the same forward-facing equanimity he brought to everything, the filing and the planning and the principled refusal to be managed. Then he thought about warm hands on his face in the grass and a thread singing between them and Gabrielle Delacour saying "You are the one, yes?" with the directness of someone who had already known the answer. He thought, yes. I think I am. He looked sideways at Fleur. She was looking straight ahead at the castle, her expression composed, her hair still wild from the run. As if she felt his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. You are thinking about all of it, she said. The whole plan. Yes. Good, she said. I have notes. He laughed. It surprised him, the genuine, unguarded kind, the kind he didn't do for audiences. It was brief and real, and Fleur looked at him sideways when it happened with an expression that suggested she was filing it in a specific location for future reference. Of course you have notes, he said. One of us should, she said, which was pointed and fair, and he accepted both. They walked into the castle. The thread sang. The graveyard was done. The rest was beginning. Chapter 6. The world adjusts. The hospital wing at 7 in the morning was the specific kind of quiet that comes after something has been thoroughly managed. The crisis was over, the visitors had been cleared, the potions had been administered, and Madame Pomfrey had retired to her office with the energy of someone who had dealt with everything she was going to deal with tonight, and was now dealing with her feelings about it privately. Harry lay on the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling and felt very awake. The graze on his heel had been healed. The bruising from the glancing curse had been reduced to a tenderness that would fade in 2 days. His hands had stopped shaking hours ago. Physically he was fine, which was the honest accounting, and the honest accounting was what he always preferred to start with. Less fine, in the accounting, was the shape of what was coming. He'd lain here for 2 hours running it. Voldemort was back, which had been expected and planned for, but expected things arriving in reality always had a weight that planning didn't fully convey. The Death Eaters who'd been in that graveyard, he'd counted 14, had noted what he could of voice and movement and wand hand. Some he'd recognized. Some he hadn't, which meant they were either new or deeply hidden. The Ministry was going to resist the truth of it, because the Ministry was a bureaucratic organism and bureaucratic organisms resisted information that required them to act at cost. Fudge would need the truth delivered in a way that didn't give him an easy refusal. Dumbledore would manage that, or Harry would manage it himself if Dumbledore's approach was too delicate. The Horcruxes were the real timeline. He'd been working on the theory for 2 years and the graveyard had confirmed enough that he could now build a practical plan rather than a theoretical one. There were multiple. He was certain of the diary, which was gone, and the ring which he'd inferred from the quality of Voldemort's magic, and at least 2 others from the way the magic had felt divided. He needed to confirm the full number and location. That required specific research that he'd already asked Hermione to begin, and that she would have started before he'd finished the sentence. He thought about all of this with the focused forward-facing quality that was his natural mode of operation and found it, not easy exactly, but tractable. The problems had shapes. Shaped problems had approaches. He wasn't afraid of the work. He heard the door. Fleur came in from the corridor with 2 cups of something hot, moving through the morning quiet of the wing with the composure of someone who had decided she was allowed to be here and had not bothered asking anyone to confirm that. She'd changed from the tournament robes into her regular clothes, and her hair was properly down, and she looked, in the precise way of someone who had been awake all night but was functioning fully regardless, like herself. She handed him one of the cups without ceremony. Tea. The right kind, which told him she'd either asked someone or had paid attention to how he took it, and both possibilities said something similar. She sat in the chair beside the bed and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him with the direct gray assessment that he'd been thinking in terms of almost since he'd seen her step off the Beauxbatons carriage and feel him across 50 feet of October lawn. "You slept?" she said. "No. Neither did I." She said it without complaint, just noting. "Madame Maxime knows most of it. I told her last night while you were being seen to. She will tell no one who shouldn't know. I trust your judgment on that." "I know you do." A pause. "Dumbledore came to see me at 2 in the morning." Harry looked at her. "To see you. He wanted to understand the nature of our connection." She said the word with a slight dryness that indicated she was aware of its inadequacy. "He asked measured questions in the careful way of someone who has done some reading and wants to confirm what they already suspect." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "Not all of it. But enough that he understands it is real and it is not something he can work around." She held his gaze. "He knows about the rite. He has known since you were 9. There is a record in the British Magical Registry. He confirmed it last night without meaning to." Harry thought about the report McGonagall had referenced in 2nd year, the careful way Dumbledore had watched him, the offer of guided development in 1st year. "He's known the whole time. Since shortly after it happened," Fleur said. "He had someone at the Department of Mysteries assess the signature shift." A pause. "He was not going to tell you?" "No," Harry said. "He wasn't." The quality of the silence between them was the particular one of 2 people who have arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and are sitting with it. Harry drank his tea and thought about a man who had known for 6 years that someone had reached across the channel and claimed Harry Potter with an ancient Veela rite, and had filed that information under things that complicate the plan and kept it from everyone who deserved to know it. He didn't feel angry. He felt, with more accuracy, the particular clarity of someone who has had a pattern confirmed and can now plan around it with full information rather than partial. "He is going to try to manage this," Harry said. "Not a question." "He is going to try," Fleur said, which was the honest version of the answer. Dumbledore arrived at 9, which meant he'd waited for a reasonable hour, and also meant he'd had a full night to organize what he wanted to say, which Harry noted and accounted for. He came in with the particular presence he always carried, warmth and authority, the specific gravity of someone who had been very important for a very long time and had learned to make that feel comfortable rather than oppressive. He settled into the second chair as though it had been placed for him, which it had been by Madame Pomfrey, who had a reverent relationship with the headmaster's comfort, and he looked at Harry with those eyes that read everything and said, "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Harry said. "Healed. Ready for the conversation." Dumbledore's expression acknowledged the directness without reacting to it. "I thought we might speak privately, Fleur stays," Harry said. "A beat." "Harry, what I need to discuss involves her," Harry said. "Directly." "You know it does." He met the blue eyes steadily. "You've known about the Rite for 6 years. You know what the threat is, what it does, what it means. Whatever you plan to say to me about managing what comes next, she's part of what comes next. So she stays." Dumbledore looked at Fleur, who was sitting in her chair with her hands folded and her expression composed and her attention fully present. He looked at her the way he looked at Harry, the comprehensive assessment, but with a different quality, the quality of someone encountering something they hadn't fully mapped yet and were rapidly mapping now. "Very well," he said, which cost him something. Harry could see that, the giving of the inch. "I should tell you first, Barty Crouch Jr. is in custody. Moody has been retrieved from the trunk. He is alive." A pause. "The minister has been informed." His response was predictable. "He doesn't believe it," Harry said. "He believes it in the way of someone for whom belief is inconvenient," Dumbledore said. "He will require time." "He doesn't have time," Harry said. "Neither does anyone else. Whatever window exists between Voldemort reforming and him re-establishing his network is the only window available for preparation, and it's closing." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "Tell me what you actually need to discuss." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Then he did something that Harry hadn't seen from him before. He let the careful warmth drop slightly, just enough to show the thing operating behind it, which was a man who was very tired and very old and carrying something for a very long time and who was, in this moment, being honest rather than managed. "I had a plan," Dumbledore said. "Built over 15 years. It required certain things from you, not immediately, not yet, but eventually. Things that would require you to not know certain facts until the right moment." He paused. "Several of those facts you have already determined independently." "The Horcruxes," Harry said. "Among others." Dumbledore's hands were clasped on his knee. "There is one piece of information that changes the nature of everything, and it was to be given to you only when you determined it was necessary," Harry said. "Not when I needed to know it. When it was useful to the plan." A pause. "Yes." "Tell me now," Harry said. "Harry, tell me," Harry said, with the same even tone, and it was not a challenge and it was not a threat, it was simply the absolute refusal to be managed by withholding, which was not a new refusal, he'd been refusing it since first year, and this time he said it out loud rather than filing it. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, which showed the June morning doing its light-on-stone thing, and something moved through his expression that was very nearly grief. Then he turned back and told Harry about the prophecy, and about the killing curse, and about what the killing curse had left behind in Harry's scar that night in Godric's Hollow when Voldemort had first come for him. Harry listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When Dumbledore finished, the hospital wing was very quiet. Fleur, beside him, had gone very still. He felt the thread, not distressed, not panicking, running the calculations with the focused intensity of someone who has received a significant variable and is incorporating it into an existing model. Harry looked at the window. He thought about a 7-piece puzzle with one piece that was a fixed point, that what was in his scar could not be removed without killing him, except that it could, because it had been put there by accident rather than design, and accidental Horcruxes didn't behave like intentional ones, and he'd been reading about the distinction for 2 years without knowing yet why it mattered. He thought about the thread. About the amplification running for 5 years. About what 5 years of compounded Veela resonance had done to the magical signatures in and around him, including the one that wasn't supposed to be there. He thought about something his grandmother's book apparently said, which was that the ancient Blood Rite recognized and amplified what was true about a person and rejected what was foreign to them. He looked at Fleur. She was already looking at him. "The thread," he said. "Yes," she said. "The amplification doesn't amplify everything indiscriminately," he said. "It amplifies what's resonant, what's compatible, and rejects what isn't," she said. "According to the original texts, what is foreign to the claimed person's nature, the thread works against. Slowly. Over time." Her voice was entirely level. "I read that passage 4 years ago and I didn't understand why it was relevant. It's been working on it for 5 years," Harry said. "Yes," she said. He turned this over. 5 years of the right working against the thing in his scar that wasn't him, that was a fragment of a fractured soul forced into a living host. The amplification running in one direction, the rejection running in another, both processes slow and quiet and continuous for 5 years. He thought about the graveyard, about the quality of his scar. It had burned when Voldemort touched him, that was expected, the scar always responded to Voldemort's presence. But there had been something else, something he noticed and filed, which was that the burn had a different character than it used to. Shallower. Less structural. As if the thing driving it had less to drive with. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was very still. "You didn't know that part," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said quietly. "I did not know that part." "How long?" Harry said. "Between now and when it's gone completely?" Dumbledore opened his mouth. Closed it. He looked at Fleur with an expression that was recalibrating too fast to conceal. "I don't know," he said. I have never encountered this. The Rite's effect on a Horcrux is not documented. It may not be, I'll find out," Fleur said, with the certainty of someone who has her grandmother's library and the personal investment to use it comprehensively. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment. Then he did something Harry hadn't seen him do before. He yielded. Not politically, not strategically. Actually yielded, the way of someone who has encountered the limits of their own model and is honest enough to acknowledge them. "I would very much appreciate that," he said. The Veela High Council arrived on a Thursday. Harry had been back at Hogwarts for a week, which had been a week of Dumbledore managing Fudge managing denial, the Order of the Phoenix beginning to reconvene in ways Harry knew about because he'd asked direct questions and received direct answers once Dumbledore had accepted that the alternative was Harry finding out independently, and that the independently route was less efficient for everyone. He was in the middle of a conversation with Hermione in the library. They were 3 weeks from the end of term. Hermione was doing her revision with one hand and helping him map Horcrux theory with the other, which was the kind of parallel processing that only Hermione could sustain, when he felt the thread give a sharp specific pulse that he'd learned to read as incoming, significant, involving Fleur directly. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. Hermione watched him go with the expression of someone who had been watching Harry respond to thread signals all year, and had stopped being surprised by the velocity. She kept her notes and added a new section heading, Veela High Council, cross-reference with Blood Rite juridical frameworks, see Chapter 14 of the Beaux Batons text Harry left on Tuesday. He found Fleur in the entrance hall. She was standing with her back to the stairs, facing 3 women who had arrived through the main doors with the specific authority of people who had not needed to knock because doors opened for them as a matter of established fact. The women were Veela, fully Veela, the kind that made the castle's ambient magic adjust slightly in response, the air going a half-degree warmer, the torches on the walls brightening without anyone touching them. The middle one was the oldest, white-haired and extraordinarily upright, with eyes that were silver rather than gray and that were currently moving between Fleur and Harry with the focused assessment of someone conducting a juridical evaluation. Fleur didn't look frightened. She looked, as she looked at everything that required her full caliber, composed, alert, ready. Harry crossed the entrance hall and stood beside her. He didn't ask what was happening. He read the situation and stood in it. The oldest woman looked at him. Her gaze on him had a physical quality, the same kind that Fleur's had in the early library mornings, the Veela capacity for seeing through surfaces to something truer. He held it without flinching and let her see whatever she was looking for, because he had nothing to hide and hiding things was a waste of energy. She spoke in French. Fleur translated with the efficiency of long practice. She says her name is Seraphine. She is the High Council's senior arbiter. She is here because the Council received a report that a blood rite of the ancient form was performed 5 years ago by a minor, and that the rite was completed. She says this requires arbitration. Fleur's voice was even. She says the claim must be confirmed or dissolved. Harry looked at Seraphine. Confirmed, he said without deliberation. Fleur translated. Seraphine's expression moved, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration similar to the one Dumbledore had done, the adjustment of someone who had prepared for a specific range of responses and received one outside that range. Seraphine spoke again. She wants to know if you understand what confirming means, Fleur said, and her voice had gone slightly more careful in the way it went when she was managing something interior. It is not a marriage contract. It is older than that. It is the acknowledgement of the rite's completion, which makes certain things permanent. What things? Harry said, not because he didn't know but because he wanted the official version on record. Fleur translated. Seraphine gave a thorough answer. Fleur was quiet for a moment after it. The thread, she said finally. It becomes more. What it is now is the rite's initial bond, which has been running and building for 5 years. Confirmation means the bond enters its final form. The resonance becomes complete. She paused. And the claim is officially recognized. No other Veela can perform a rite that would affect either of us. It is a permanent exclusion. Harry thought about the no other which could touch him quality of what the rite had been doing quietly for 5 years, which was already a fact on the ground and had been a fact on the ground since he was 8. Making it official changed the social and legal architecture around something that the magic had already settled. Yes, he said. Confirmed. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The silver eyes were reading him in layers, the way the thread did, looking for the quality of the statement. Was it reckless? Was it informed? Was it the decision of someone who understood what they were agreeing to or someone who was performing confidence without the substance? She looked at Fleur. She asked a question in French that she didn't ask for translation on, which meant it was personal. Fleur answered it in French with a directness that needed no translation from Harry's perspective, because the quality of it was the same quality she brought to everything she was sure of, no performance, no hedging, the simple fact of the thing. Seraphine looked between them for a long moment. Then something in the silver eyes shifted, not warmth exactly, because she was a senior arbiter, and warmth was not the job, but something that acknowledged what it was looking at. She spoke for a long time. Fleur listened. When Seraphine finished, Fleur said to Harry, "She says the rite was irregular? A child of 9 performing an ancient blood rite without training or intent is unprecedented in the recorded history of the form. She says the council spent 5 years debating whether to intervene, because the irregular nature of it raised the question of validity." A pause. She says the debate ended when they read the amplification data. She says in 40 years of juridical work she has seen 3 ancient blood rites complete. She says the resonance signature from this one is... Fleur stopped briefly. What did she say? Harry said. Fleur looked at him with the expression that wasn't quite the smile, but contained it. She said it is the largest she has ever recorded, Fleur said. By a significant margin. He looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked back with the silver eyes. Thank you, he said to Seraphine, who nodded once with the economy of someone who valued precision over ceremony. Then Seraphine said one more thing, very brief, and Fleur's mouth moved at the corner. What? Harry said. She says, Fleur said, with the particular composure of someone keeping the smile private, that she has reviewed your magical signature as part of the confirmation process, and that you are the most interesting thing she has encountered since 1962, when she arbitrated a claim between a full heritage Veela and a Norwegian sea witch, and that the outcome of that one had significant implications for 3 generations. A pause. She says she expects similar outcomes here. No pressure, Harry said. Fleur translated. Seraphine's expression did something that was, on a senior arbiter, the equivalent of a full laugh. Dumbledore met the council delegation that afternoon, which was a meeting Harry was not officially present for and attended anyway, standing in the corridor outside the office with the particular quality of attention that could read through closed doors if the magical events inside were significant enough. He could hear enough. The shapes of things. Dumbledore's careful voice and Seraphine's authority, and the specific back and forth of 2 powerful people determining the architecture of a relationship. He heard the boy from Dumbledore, and the claim from Seraphine, and understood from the quality of the exchange that Dumbledore was attempting to establish a framework in which Harry's situation was a complicating factor in the existing plan, and Seraphine was establishing that the existing plan was a complicating factor in Harry's situation, which was a different and more accurate framing. He heard Dumbledore say the prophecy in a lower voice and heard the quality of Seraphine's response, which was in French, and which he caught enough of to understand that the Council's position was that the prophecy existed inside the wizarding world's framework and that the rite existed inside a framework considerably older, and that when 2 frameworks conflicted the older one established precedent. He heard Dumbledore go quiet for a while after that. He heard Seraphine say, toward the end, something that his French wasn't quite equal to but that Fleur translated for him later. He was never yours to plan with. You should have learned that in the first year. He thought Dumbledore probably knew that. He thought Dumbledore had known it for a while and had been hoping the knowing would stay theoretical. Ron found him that evening on the astronomy tower, which was where Harry went when he needed space and altitude, and the specific quality of open sky. Ron came up the stairs with the dedication of someone who had decided this conversation was happening, and was not deterred by the climb. He stood beside Harry at the parapet and looked out at the grounds for a while without saying anything, which was one of Ron's genuinely underrated qualities. So, Ron said eventually. So, Harry agreed. The Veela Council was here. Yes. And they confirmed Ron searched for the word. The claim, Harry said. Right. Ron was quiet. Which means you and Fleur are, it's complicated, Harry said, which was the honest version. The bond is confirmed. What we are to each other is still developing. He thought about warm hands on his face in the grass, about laughing in the grounds while she said I have notes, with pointed precision. It's not a marriage. It's not a simple thing. It's older than the categories people usually use. Ron processed this. You're happy about it, he said, which was less a question than an observation. Harry thought about it honestly, which was how he thought about everything. Yes, he said. Even with. Ron gestured at the general landscape of everything. All the rest of it. The tournament. The graveyard. Voldemort coming back. The Horcruxes. All the rest of it is work, Harry said. It's important work and it's going to be hard and it's going to take time. But it's work. He looked out at the grounds. The thread is the other thing. Both can be true. Ron was quiet for a moment. She's good, he said finally, with the economy of someone who has been observing carefully, and has distilled it to the essential. Fleur. She looks at you like you're the correct answer to a question she's been working on for a long time. 5 years, Harry said. Right. Ron considered. And you look at her like she's the first person who's ever told you the full truth about yourself. Harry looked at Ron. Ron was looking at the grounds with the studied casualness of someone who has said something more perceptive than he usually admits to and is not going to be embarrassed about it. When did you get good at that? Harry said. I've always been good at that, Ron said. I just usually don't bother. He paused. Hermione says you're going to be all right. About the other thing. The scar thing. He said it without flinching, which was a particular kind of loyalty. The kind that didn't look away from the difficult facts. Fleur is looking into it properly, Harry said. With her grandmother's research. The Rite's rejection effect on foreign magical objects, the theory is sound. We need the data. But you think it's true? I think it explains things I've noticed for years that I didn't have a framework for, Harry said. The scar burns less than it used to. The connection to him feels shallower. Something has been changing. He paused. I think it's been changing since I was 9 years old, and I think it will finish when it's ready. Ron nodded slowly. So you might not have to, I might not have to, Harry said. Yes. Another silence. The grounds were going gold in the evening light, the lake flat and still, the forbidden forest dark at the edges. He thought about the summer ahead, leaving Hogwarts, the Order, the work that needed doing and the time it would take. He thought about Privet Drive, which he was not going back to, a decision that was not up for discussion and that he'd already communicated to Dumbledore in terms that Dumbledore had not argued with. You're not going back to the Dursleys, Ron said. No. Mum already. Ron stopped. Started again. Mum wanted me to tell you that there's a room at the Burrow. She was going to write, but I said I'd tell you in person because she wanted it to be from the family. Not a letter. Harry looked at Ron. She said it's yours for as long as you need it, Ron said, with the particular dignity of someone delivering something that matters and knowing it matters. She said, you know how she talks? She said you've always been family, and the guest room is going to feel like yours by the time she's done with it. The thing that happened in Harry's chest was not the thread. It was something of his own, entirely his own, without magic attached, and it was the specific weight of kindness offered without expectation and received by someone who had not received enough of it to find it ordinary. Tell her yes, Harry said. Tell her I said thank you? Ron nodded. They stood at the parapet a while longer in the comfortable silence that was one of the things about Ron that never got enough credit. Fleur found him later, in the library for the last time before the end of term, because the library was where they had always done the real work. The school was emptying around the edges, trunks and corridors, the specific noise of a year concluding, fourth years celebrating being fourth years no longer, while the graduated seventh years had a quality of finality about them that was its own kind of weather. The library was still quiet, early evening, the light long and golden through the high windows. She put her notebook on the table. He put his on the table. Between them, 5 months of shared notes, and running theory and the specific archaeology of two people working out something that had been running since before they could understand it. She sat across from him and looked at her notebook, and then at him. Grandmother responded this morning, she said. And? The rejection effect is real, she said. She says there are 2 documented cases in the pre-modern records of the ancient Blood Rite intersecting with dark object binding. In both cases the foreign magical object was eventually expelled from the claimed person's system. She opened her notebook to a specific page. The timeline varied. The minimum documented case was 6 years from Rite completion. The maximum was 11. He did the arithmetic. The Rite completed when I was 8, he said. We're at 5 years, almost 6. She says the spike at the graveyard may have accelerated the process, Fleur said. When Voldemort's magic hit the scar directly and the scar's defense responded, the conflict may have done additional work on the fragment. She paused. She says she thinks it will be within 2 years. 2 years? Harry said. No more, Fleur said, with the certainty of someone reporting her grandmother's assessment, which was the most reliable source available. Possibly less. He sat with this for a moment. 2 years, and then the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been living in his head since he was 15 months old would be gone. The connection severed. The prophecy's specific mechanism, either can live while the other survives, was predicated on the accidental Horcrux. Without it, the prophecy's terms changed. The meaning of it shifted. "Does that change the work?" he said. "The other Horcruxes. The strategy." "No," Fleur said. "The other Horcruxes still need to be found and destroyed. Voldemort's mortal vulnerability still depends on that work. The fragment in you being expelled doesn't change the external pieces." She met his eyes. "It only changes the piece that was always wrong. The piece that was never supposed to be there." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been carrying this," he said, "since you read about the rejection effect 4 years ago. Knowing there might be something in me that your right was working against." "I didn't know if it was true," she said. "But you thought it might be." "Yes. And you didn't tell me until you had confirmation." "I wasn't going to give you a theory about something this significant without data," she said, with the precision of someone who has thought hard about this distinction and stands by it. "Fleur." He said her name in the register they developed for the real things, the things beneath the work. "It's all right. Whatever you were carrying, it's all right." She looked at him. "I put something in you without asking," she said. "Even if it was accidental. And then I spent 5 years hoping it hadn't, complicated things in ways I couldn't fix." She held his gaze. "It turns out it may have fixed a thing I didn't know needed fixing. I am still." She paused, coming to terms with the fact that those two things can both be true. "They can," he said. "Easily." "Not easily," she said. "But possibly." He looked at her and thought about what he knew of her, which was more than he knew of most people and was still less than he was going to know. He thought about the 9-year-old who had performed an ancient rite in her sleep and woken up to consequences she hadn't chosen. He thought about the 17-year-old who had brought her whole self to bear on the task of understanding what she'd done. He thought about the girl who'd read the rejection effect passage 4 years ago and said nothing, and carried it, and waited for data, because she was the kind of person who waited for data. He thought, she was never going to be ordinary, and neither was I, and whatever this is between us is going to be the most interesting thing in both our lives for a considerable amount of time. He thought, I'm looking forward to it. "I have a question," he said. "Ask it." "When the thread enters its final form," he said, "after the confirmation, Seraphine said the resonance becomes complete. What does that feel like?" She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, the interior version of her expressions, the one she kept mostly for herself and had started, in the last months, allowing him to see. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't felt it yet. Neither have you. It takes time after confirmation, it builds." She paused. "Grandmother says it feels like being fully known. Not in a frightening way. In the way of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and sets it down and finds that the person beside them is strong enough to carry it with them." He held her gaze. The thread was doing what it did, warm, constant, running clear between them in both directions. He felt, through it, the quality of her, the depth of her attention, the precision of her care, the particular fierceness she brought to things she loved, which included her sister and her grandmother and her own principles and, increasingly, him. He felt her feel, through it, whatever she felt from him. He didn't know exactly what that was from her perspective, didn't have the full translation. But he'd felt her respond to it with enough consistency that he had a rough map. "That sounds," he said, "like what it already feels like." She was quiet. "The fully known part," he said. "That's already." He stopped. Tried again. "You are the first person who has known the full size of what I am and not been frightened of it. The first person who looked at the thread and the amplification and the graveyard and the Horcrux and the entire complicated architecture of what I carry and said, good. I have notes. Let's work." Her mouth moved at the corner. "You have notes on everything," he said. "You have notes on me. You have notes on the notes. I do, she said. I'm not complaining. I know you're not. The light through the windows was going amber, the library's last light quality, the one he associated now specifically with mornings that had started here, with the particular education of two people working out something together that neither could work out alone. I'm going to the borough this summer, he said. Ron's family. I know, she said. I'll be in France. Grandmother has the full research to go through on the timeline. A pause. I'll write back, he said. You'd better, she said, with the dry flatness that was her version of a great deal of feeling kept in a small space. I have questions that require your input, and I am not waiting until September. He smiled. The real one, the full version, the one that surprised him when it happened. What kind of questions? The Horcrux I suspect is at Hogwarts, she said, opening her notebook with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been waiting to address this since at least lunchtime. Your account of the Chamber of Secrets, and the diary suggests Voldemort had access to specific Hogwarts locations. I have 3 candidate objects from the school's inventory records. Hermione got me the access, don't ask how, and I need your sense reading of each one to confirm or eliminate. He looked at the list she turned toward him. He looked at her face, fully focused, present, already moving forward into the work that needed doing. He thought, this is what the rest of it looks like. Not just the war, not just the Horcruxes. Her. This. The work and the thread and the specific extraordinary fact of someone who had found him before he knew he could be found. He pulled the notebook toward him and picked up a quill. The middle one, he said, indicating the second candidate object on her list. I've walked past it 3 times this year and something felt wrong. I filed it under investigate later. She took the notebook back and wrote rapidly. Can you describe the texture of the wrongness? Same family as the diary, he said. Divided. Like something talking to you from the wrong side of a mirror. She wrote. Location? 7th floor, he said. The commando room, the room of requirement. It's full enough that something could be hidden there indefinitely if placed correctly. More writing. Good, she said, in the tone of someone checking a significant box. That's the Ravenclaw diadem, I think. The records suggest. They worked for an hour, until the library closed around them and Madame Pants made her end-of-day announcement that was less an announcement than a declaration of territorial rights. They packed up their notes with the routine ease of people who had been doing this for months, and walked out into the corridor where the school was doing its last evening of term thing, noise and movement and the particular energy of a year releasing. At the corridor junction where their paths diverged, she to the Beauxbatons wing, he to Gryffindor Tower, they stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The thread ran between them clear and warm and full of everything it had been building toward for 5 years. The specific resonance of 2 people whose natures had been finding each other since before they knew what finding meant. Summer, she said. Summer, he agreed. Write me about the room of requirement before you leave Hogwarts tomorrow, she said. Specific details. I need the full account before Grandmother and I cross-reference. Before I leave tomorrow, he confirmed. She nodded. Then she did something he hadn't seen from her in public. She reached out and touched his arm, briefly, the same unceremonious contact she'd used in the grass after the graveyard, and the touch was warm and specific and entirely itself. You did well this year, she said, with the directness that was hers and that always meant exactly what it said. So did you, he said, with the same directness back. She removed her hand. Looked at him one more time with those gray eyes that had found him across 50 feet of October lawn 8 months ago, and had been reading him clearly ever since. Then she walked away down the corridor with the composed, unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where she's going. He watched her go. The thread was warm. He turned and walked toward Gryffindor Tower, and the castle was loud around him with the end of the year, and he thought about the summer and the work and the long, careful shape of everything that was coming. The Horcruxes, the Order, the war, all of it large and demanding and real. He thought about his mother's voice in the graveyard's echo. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the second parchment, and be what you are, all of it, and what it had taken to learn that the instruction was not a warning but a permission. He thought about a 9-year-old girl in her grandmother's garden in the south of France, frightened for her sister, her magic reaching out in her sleep and crossing the channel and finding him, not the version of him that the world wanted, not the symbol, or the instrument, or the planned component. Him. The actual version, the full size of it, the thing that burned too bright for cupboards. He thought, she found exactly what she was looking for, even though either of them knew that yet. The portrait hole opened. He went in. The common room was warm and full, and Ron was there already, feet up, thoroughly at ease, and Hermione was at the table with her revision finished and 2 new notebooks started, and they were both exactly what they were, which was the people who had decided to stand beside him without needing a reason beyond the fact that he was worth standing beside. He sat down. Fleur's confirmed the diadem theory, he told Hermione. She has the records. We need to get into the room of requirement before we leave tomorrow. Hermione had a quill in her hand before he finished the sentence. Ron passed him a butterbeer without looking away from the fire. Right, Hermione said. Tell me what you found, he told her. Outside, the June night settled over Hogwarts, and the lake was still, and the grounds were quiet, and somewhere across the channel a circular stone room held very old books with silver ink that still shimmered after centuries, and somewhere in that room a 17-year-old was adding tonight's findings to a notebook that was very nearly full. The thread hummed. Warm. Clear. Constant. The world had adjusted, or it was going to. There wasn't really a choice in that, not when what was on the other side of the adjusting was this particular combination of things, this particular size of what 2 people could be together when either of them was small about it. It would figure itself out. It always did, when the thing at the center of it was real,